Hey there, welcome to Brad Arrows. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. If these stories give you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get cozy and let the fear take over. The night shift delivery. You know, sometimes life throws you such curveballs that you grab onto any lifeline just to stay afloat. I was your typical broke college student at a mid-tier state university in Ohio. My studies were going okay, but money was catastrophically tight. My parents helped when they could, but they lived modestly hundreds of miles away, and my financial aid, well, you understand how that goes. Rent for my tiny studio apartment near campus was eating up most of my budget, and the prospect of surviving on nothing but ramen noodles was looming very clearly on the horizon. Job hunting had been fruitless for months. Delivery driver, warehouse worker, flyering for local businesses. Everything was either unstable or paid so little that I might as well have just donated plasma instead. And just when I was about to give up, scrolling through job sites for the 100th time, I stumbled across a posting that seemed almost too good to be true. Night operator needed for automated package pickup station. Schedule, 2 nights on, 2 nights off. Hours, 10 p.m. to 8 a.m. High pay, stable hours. No experience required, training provided. High pay and night shifts were exactly what I needed. During the day, I could study, catch up on sleep, maybe even find some small side gig. I responded immediately. They called back surprisingly fast. The very next day, they invited me for an interview. The office of Quick Drop Logistics turned out to be a modest space in a rundown business center on the outskirts of town. I was met by Mr. Davidson, a man in his 50s with a tired face, bags under his eyes, but with some kind of nervous, twitchy energy, and what seemed to me like an overly wide smile. He spoke quickly, as if afraid I might change my mind. Marcus, right. College student, excellent, he said with a sweeping gesture, inviting me to sit on a creaky office chair. The work isn't demanding, but it's responsible, especially at night. The pickup station itself is located in, let's say, a specific area, but you're a young, strong guy, you won't be scared. I shrugged, trying to look confident, though the mention of a specific area was already making me a bit nervous. The location isn't exactly downtown, Mr. Davidson continued, lowering his voice and leaning toward me across the desk, which made me catch a faint smell of valerian. It's a basement space in an old building, TechCorp Industries. You know it, out by the industrial zone. There are still some small offices operating upstairs, Vector Solutions or something. Dead quiet at night. That building has quite a history, you understand. They say all kinds of research went on there back in the 80s and 90s. Doesn't matter to us though. We got the basement space for the pickup station almost for free. Did some cosmetic renovation, installed new equipment. Everything's automated. Customers get their packages by entering codes at the terminal. So, what exactly would my job be? I asked, trying to understand what they were paying good money for. Your job, Marcus, is presence. Mr. Davidson slapped his palm on the desk so suddenly that I jumped. To keep the lights on, cameras recording, system running. To make sure the place isn't empty at night, you understand. Well, if some late customer shows up and has trouble with the terminal, help them out. But that rarely happens. At night, packages are picked up by just a few people. Mostly you'll be sitting, monitoring the screen, making sure everything's running normally. There's internet, you can do your own things, study, watch movies. Main thing is to be there and keep everything working. The door there is solid, 2 locks plus a security gate. No unauthorized access. The area is kind of patrolled at night. SecureMax makes rounds around the perimeter every couple hours. So it's safe, almost like a bunker. Quiet and peaceful, very peaceful, maybe too peaceful. I knew TechCorp Industries. That massive, gloomy building of gray brick and concrete, built back in the 70s. It stood on the outskirts, surrounded by a half-crumbling concrete fence topped with barbed wire that had rusted in places and hung in ugly loops. During the day, it looked dreary and abandoned, despite the few plastic windows on some floors that looked like cataracts on a giant's blind eyes. Various rumors circulated about it, from mundane ghost stories about disgruntled scientists whose experiments went wrong, to completely wild theories about secret biological or even parapsychological research that allegedly took place in closed laboratories. They said that in the 90s, God knows what went on there when oversight was weak. The basement of such a building wasn't the most cheerful prospect, but the salary Mr. Davidson mentioned outweighed all doubts. It was almost twice what I could expect at any other job without experience, and it would let me not only pay rent but eat properly too. I accept, I said firmly, trying not to think about urban legends. Money is money. Excellent. Mr. Davidson seemed genuinely relieved, his tension appearing to ease somewhat. Only I don't quite understand who'll be picking up packages there at night. Well, packages will be picked up by, impatient local residents. No, people who ordered something and can't wait to get it. They just want it faster. Mr. Davidson waved off my question dismissively. Let's get the paperwork done. Here's a short instruction manual for the system. Here are the keys, access codes. First shift is the day after tomorrow. Any questions? What's the story with that TechCorp building? I couldn't help asking. Oh, rumors. They're completely groundless. Mr. Davidson's smile dimmed slightly, becoming more formal. He rubbed his nose bridge. Yeah, just rumors, urban tales. He waved his hand vaguely. Ordinary corporate facility. Some chemists worked there than others, physicists. They say something related to low temperatures and some kind of fields they studied. Don't pay attention to it, mostly abandoned now. Main thing is the basement is dry. There's electricity, solid structure, works for us. And all those ghosts, that's for teenagers. You're not 15. All right, Marcus, I'll expect you the day after tomorrow at the site. Don't be late. And if something seems strange, well, if a light flickers or some sound, don't pay attention. Old building, wiring, pipes, you understand. Equipment sometimes glitches. Main thing is the system works and the door stays locked. Clear. Clear, I nodded, though his last words sounded somehow ambiguous and only increased my growing anxiety. Security, there's plenty because of old equipment left behind, and it's required by building status, he said, shoving into my hands a bundle of heavy, old-style keys and one modern plastic card, a pass with the company logo, and a printout with instructions listing codes and his mobile number for emergency contact. I left the office with a strange mixture of luck and inexplicable sticky anxiety, as if I just signed up for something more than just a night job. I got to the location on the second-to-last bus, which dropped me off at a deserted stop at the edge of the industrial zone. From there, it was about a 20-minute walk along a broken road, past rusty fences of warehouses and abandoned workshops, where scrap metal hunters had broken out window frames in dark openings. Wind howled between the concrete giants, whining in the rebar, and swaying the few dimly glowing streetlights that created more shadows than illumination. The TechCorp building in the darkness looked even more ominous than I remembered it. A real concrete mastodon, black, silent, with rare glowing windows on the upper floors where, according to Mr. Davidson, someone still worked. Black voids of other windows, peeling plaster. Silence broken only by the creaking of old wood somewhere on the roof and distant barking of dogs. Entrance to the basement I needed turned out to be on the side of the building, around the corner, hidden from prying eyes by weeds and old rusty dumpsters. A heavy metal door without identifying marks, covered in obscene graffiti and some strange, incomprehensible symbols resembling runes or alchemical signs. Next to it was a code lock panel all scratched up and a camera eye smeared with dirt. I entered the code Mr. Davidson had given me. The lock beeped and clicked. The door creaked open, releasing a wave of stale air. Behind it was a steep, narrow concrete staircase leading down into impenetrable darkness. It smelled of dampness, mold, and something else. I turned on my phone's flashlight, lighting my way. The walls were covered with stains and peeling paint. Some kind of debris crunched underfoot. Going down one flight, I ran into a massive barred door covered in rust. It looked like it had been taken from some prison cell. I opened it with one of the heavy old keys. The screech from the lock echoed through the stairwell. Behind the bars was a small vestibule and another door, this time modern, metallic, gray, with a small quick-drop logistics logo. It seemed like an alien element in this kingdom of decay. Opening it with the second key, then the plastic card, and pushing, I finally found myself inside. The contrast was striking and almost surreal. After the dark, shabby, decay-smelling staircase, I entered a brightly lit, sterile, clean space. Long, narrow hall resembling a subway car. The walls were lined with light gray plastic panels, gray linoleum on the floor without a single scratch. Along one wall were 3 rows of gleaming metal pickup lockers, about 150 of them, I figured different sizes, with electronic locks and small blue displays. Perfectly even, faceless. Opposite was a neat office desk made of light particle board with a computer, flat monitor, keyboard, and mouse. The monitor showed a welcome screen for the pickup station management system and 2 windows from surveillance cameras. One showed the entrance area in front of the bars, the other a general view of the hall with lockers. Next to the desk was an ordinary office chair on wheels. In the corner were a water cooler with a full bottle, a microwave, and an electric kettle, all absolutely new. Air was a bit stale, but air conditioning or ventilation was working, creating a quiet, monotonous hum that should have been calming, but somehow only emphasized the dead silence of this place. Besides this hum, not a sound. Absolute, almost vacuum silence. I closed the doors behind me, carefully checked the locks, the inner metal one with a key and latch, the bars too with a key. I sat at the desk, turned on the computer. The system loaded quickly, asked for a password that was in the instructions. Interface was intuitive. Active orders list currently empty. No active deliveries for today. Locker status, all closed and marked green. Event log, so far only entries about system startup and connection checks. Camera control, the picture from the cameras was clear and color. I connected my laptop to the local Wi-Fi. The password was written on a sticker attached to the monitor. The speed was surprisingly good. Apparently they'd run fiber optic cable here after all. The first few hours passed absolutely peacefully, even boringly. I replied to messages from friends, lying that I'd gotten a job as a night security guard at some office. Watched a couple episodes of some forgettable series. Had tea with cookies I'd thoughtfully brought with me. The silence and solitude even started to feel pleasant after the noisy dorm and city hustle. Nobody bothering me, not disturbing me. Perfect work for an introverted loner, which I basically was. The cameras showed emptiness, the hall, the stairway landing in front of the bars. Everything was motionless and deserted. Not one customer, not one system notification. I even started thinking that Mr. Davidson was right and all the rumors about TechCorp were just nonsense. Around 1 a.m., I started feeling tired. The series was boring. My eyes were closing. I decided to stretch a bit and walk around the hall to perk up. I walked along the rows of lockers, cold, smooth metal, even rows of identical doors. Each had a small display showing number and status. Closed. Everything was perfect. Too perfect for a basement of an old corporate building. I returned to the desk, opened a textbook. I still needed to prepare for exams, and you couldn't think of better time for cramming. And then I heard it. A quiet, barely audible click, as if an electronic lock had activated somewhere. Very quiet, on the edge of hearing. I raised my head, listened. Ventilation silence, must have imagined it. Probably my brain, tired from monotony, was starting to generate sounds on its own. I tried to focus on formulas and graphs, but about 10 minutes later the click repeated, more distinctly. Then again from a different direction. Now I was sure the sound was coming from the direction of the lockers. I got up and slowly walked along the middle row, carefully examining each door. All were tightly closed, displays showing closed. I stopped, holding my breath, listening. Another click somewhere to the right in the bottom row, then another to the left from above. Random, without any visible system or logic, as if someone invisible was randomly tapping on sensor panels or checking locks from inside. Maybe power fluctuations, I thought, remembering Mr. Davidson's words. The building was old, the wiring probably on its last legs. Or the system was running some kind of self-diagnostics in background mode. Mr. Davidson hadn't mentioned anything like that, but you never know. Maybe it's a new feature. I shrugged, trying to stay calm, and returned to the desk. But I couldn't concentrate on studying anymore. Now every rustle, every quiet sound in the room seemed suspicious. Locker clicking continued with varying frequency, sometimes quieting down for so long that I managed to calm down a bit, sometimes producing a whole series of rapid clicks like someone was tapping out incomprehensible messages in Morse code on the metal doors. It was starting to get on my nerves. Around 3 a.m., a system notification popped up on the computer monitor, accompanied by a quiet melodic signal that sounded inappropriately cheerful in this silence. Warning: unauthorized locker opening detected. Locker B38. Status: error. I stared at the screen. Unauthorized opening, error. I checked the locker status in the general list. Indeed, it was marked red with the text open error. But how? Nobody had approached, nobody had entered codes. I hadn't opened anything myself. I quickly went to the indicated locker. Bottom row, almost in the center of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, about 2 centimeters, and a light chill was coming through the gap, even though the ventilation was set to heating. I carefully pulled it toward me. It opened easily without the lock clicking. Inside was absolutely empty. No package, no note, nothing. Just an empty metal box, cold to the touch. Electronics malfunction, I muttered, trying to convince myself. Lock glitched. I slammed the door shut. It closed with the usual click, and the red error indicator on the display changed to the standard closed text. I returned to the computer. The system had also updated the status. B38 was again listed as closed and green. The error message disappeared from active notifications, but remained in the event log. Strange, but probably happens. A glitch. I'd have to mention this to Mr. Davidson in the morning. I decided to make myself more tea to perk up and calm my nerves. While waiting for the kettle to boil, my gaze wandered aimlessly across the monitor, showing the camera feed directed at the rows of lockers. The camera hung under the ceiling at the opposite end of the hall from me, and gave a good view of almost the entire room. And then I froze, feeling not just a chill, but a wave of icy horror run down my spine. At the far end of the hall, between the last row of lockers and the wall, where the lighting was slightly dimmer due to the lamp placement, stood a figure. A dark, vague silhouette, definitely resembling a human. The image wasn't perfect, slightly grainy like on old film, but I clearly saw the contours of a tall, very thin being standing completely motionless and looking, it seemed, directly at the camera or through it at me. It was darker than the surrounding environment, as if absorbing light. My heart jumped and started beating somewhere in my throat with such force that it became painful. I spun around sharply, peering at that end of the hall. Empty. The bright light of LED lamps left no room for dark corners or shadow play. Gray wall panels, even rows of gleaming lockers. Nobody. Absolutely nobody. I stared at the monitor again. The figure was there. It wasn't moving, just standing like a dark spot, like a silhouette cut from blackness against a light background. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. No, not hallucinating. I zoomed in on the image. The quality got worse, digital artifacts appeared, but the silhouette didn't disappear. It was real, at least to the camera. It was standing there in my bunker with me. "What the hell?" I whispered, feeling my hands and legs start to shake. This no longer looked like a system glitch. This was something else, something impossible, something that shouldn't be there. I got up from the chair, my legs felt like cotton, and trying to step as quietly as possible, I walked toward that end of the hall, not taking my eyes off the monitor where the terrifying figure stood frozen. I was walking toward it, and it wasn't reacting, wasn't moving. Now I was almost at the target, standing a couple meters from that spot. The figure on the screen was still there. I slowly extended my hand and touched the wall where the figure stood on the monitor. Cold, smooth plastic. Nothing. The air was normal, no colder or warmer. I turned around, looked at the camera under the ceiling. A small black lens stared indifferently at me. When I slowly returned to the desk, the figure was no longer on the monitor. It had simply disappeared, dissolved as if it had never been there at all. But I had seen it for 30 seconds at least, and that memory could no longer be erased. I collapsed into the chair, feeling weakness throughout my body and approaching nausea. "Okay, Marcus, calm down. Fatigue, stress, sleep deprivation. First night shifts are always tough. Maybe it was some complex play of light and shadow that only the camera caught. Or a matrix defect. Or this place really was cursed. I needed to find a logical explanation. I had to. Otherwise, I'd just go insane here before morning. I tried to get back to the textbook, but the letters swam before my eyes. The anxiety wouldn't let go. On the contrary, it grew with each minute. The locker clicking had stopped, but now the silence seemed even more ominous, tense, full of expectation. I listened to every sound, jumping at the quiet hum of ventilation that now seemed like someone's whisper. I tried calling Mr. Davidson. Long beeps and silence in response. And then the system beeped again with its inappropriate signal. This time the message was different. Pickup scheduled. Locker D15. Code received. I went cold. Pickup by whom? It was 3:30 a.m. Today's order list was empty. I checked again. No active deliveries, no scheduled pickups. Code received from whom? I slowly, with a heavy feeling, approached locker D15. Middle row, closer to the exit. The display no longer showed enter code. Instead it showed locker opening, and after a few seconds, a click, and the door smoothly opened by itself. I cautiously looked inside. At the bottom lay a small object, an old key darkened with age, of intricate shape with a bizarre head decorated with some complex pattern I couldn't make out in the locker's dim light. It lay just like that, without any packaging on the bare metal bottom. Where had it come from? Who had put it there? And why had the system decided to dispense it right now, after I'd seen that figure? I carefully picked up the key with 2 fingers. It was cold, almost icy, and unexpectedly heavy for its size, as if made not of brass or iron, but of something denser. The pattern on the head was not just complex, but somehow wrong, asymmetrical, causing slight dizziness if you looked at it too long. I turned it over in my hands. No inscriptions or marks except this strange pattern, just an old key that had appeared from nowhere. I quickly shut the locker. The lock clicked. I put the key on the desk next to the computer, trying not to look at it, what to do with it. Leave it here, throw it away, tell Mr. Davidson. But what would I say? The locker opened by itself and dispensed an antique key that looks like a horror artifact. He'd definitely think I'd lost it, or worse, that I'd planted it there myself. Before I could properly think through the situation, a new sound rang out, this time not from the hall but from outside, from the staircase. Distinct footsteps. Someone was coming down, slowly, heavily, with some kind of shuffling, as if dragging their feet or something else. I froze, listening. Blood froze in my veins. The footsteps were approaching. They didn't sound like the steps of an ordinary person. There was something wrong about them, an irregular rhythm, too much weight for such a narrow staircase. They stopped right in front of the barred door. I heard someone's breathing, wheezing, intermittent, with a whistle, like an asthmatic, or as if bellows were pumping air. On the monitor, the camera directed at the entrance still showed nobody. Lens looked slightly higher, capturing the bars themselves and part of the staircase behind them. But the landing right in front of the door remained a blind spot. But I clearly heard the footsteps and that terrible breathing. It was very close on the other side of the door. Could the camera really not capture the landing right in front of the door? Or was whatever stood there invisible to it, like the figure in the hall? I sat motionless, afraid even to breathe. Who could this be? SecureMax Security. But Mr. Davidson said they only patrol the building perimeter. They don't wander around basements at 4 a.m. A random passerby, a homeless person looking for shelter. But how did they get inside the building and down here through locked, coded doors? And where was that breathing coming from? The breathing behind the door became louder, more insistent, almost turning into wheezing. And then there was a knock. 3 sharp, strong blows on the metal bars. The sound was so forceful that I physically felt the vibration. I jerked and recoiled from the desk so sharply that the wheeled chair rolled back to the wall. "Who's there?" My voice cracked into a squeak, betraying my trembling. There was no answer, only silence for a moment, and then again that wheezing, bubbling breathing. And then I saw on the monitor how the handle of the barred door slowly, very slowly, turned downward to the stop. But the door was locked with a key from inside. Handle jerked once, twice, with a nasty metallic screech, and froze. The wheezing breathing suddenly stopped. I heard retreating footsteps, the same slow, heavy, shuffling ones going up the staircase. Then everything went quiet. The silence seemed deafening after that tension. I sat for 5 or maybe 10 minutes without moving, trying to calm the trembling throughout my body. What the hell was that? An attempted break-in. But who would try to break into a pickup station in the middle of the night in an abandoned corporate building with such force? And why couldn't I see them on camera? And that breathing, it was inhuman. I decided I needed to get out immediately. Screw the job, the money, Mr. Davidson. My safety and possibly my sanity were more valuable. I couldn't stay here another minute. This place was wrong. It was alive, and it was hostile. I tried calling Mr. Davidson again, just in case, to report that I was leaving. Same result, long beeps. I sent another text, more desperate. "Mr. Davidson, something's happening here. I'm leaving. Can't stay here anymore. Someone's trying to break down the door." The message went through, but of course there was no reply. The clock on the computer showed 4:12 a.m. Almost 4 more hours until the end of the shift. 4 more hours in this damned basement where lockers opened by themselves. Ghosts appeared on cameras, and invisible, terrible visitors breathed and knocked behind the door. No, I wouldn't last. I started feverishly gathering my things, stuffed my laptop into my backpack, along with the charger, thermos, leftover cookies, when the system beeped again with the familiar notification sound and text on screen. Pickup scheduled. Locker '07. Code received. Damn it, again. Burst out of me at full volume. Anger momentarily overcame fear. I almost ran to locker '07, top row, right by the entrance. The display already showed locker opening. Click. The door opened. Inside lay a small flat box made of dark, almost black wood about the size of a cigarette pack. No inscriptions, no lock. Perfectly smooth and somehow oily to the touch. I cautiously, expecting a trick, took it. It was strangely warm, as if it had just been taken from a pocket or oven, and very light, almost weightless. I shook it. Something rustled quietly inside, like dry sand or leaves. I definitely wasn't going to open it. It gave off a barely perceptible strange smell, a mixture of ozone, dry earth, and something else unfamiliar and unpleasant. Putting the box on the desk next to the icy key, I had firmly decided. That's it, enough, I'm leaving right now. I grabbed my backpack, threw it over my shoulder. I demonstratively left the key and box on the desk. Not mine, not taking them. Let whoever put them here or whoever they were intended for take them. I went to the control panel next to the desk and pressed the emergency power shutdown button. There was one like that, red under a clear plastic cover, like in disaster movies. There was a relay click somewhere in the electrical panel. The computer screen went dark. The camera monitors went out. The bright LED lamps in the hall went out too. Only dim emergency lighting came on, a couple of yellowish bulbs above the entrance, and at the far end of the hall, apparently running on battery. The room plunged into oppressive, viscous twilight where shadows became long and deep. The silence became absolutely crushing without the familiar ventilation hum. Only my own pulse pounding frantically in my ears. It became even scarier, but I thought that the de-energized system might stop its tricks, stop opening lockers and attracting whoever. I rushed to the exit, with trembling hands inserted the key into the inner metal door lock, turned it, then did the same with the bars. The old lock didn't give way immediately. The key stuck. Finally, I managed it, pushed the heavy bars. They creaked and moved aside. I stepped into the vestibule and pulled the metal door handle toward me, and froze on the threshold without managing to open it. On the stairway landing, right in front of me in the dim light of the single bulb on the staircase, stood it. Or rather, it. The creature was very tall, about 7 feet, and unnaturally thin, almost skeletal. It stood slightly hunched, as if the ceiling was too low for it. It was dressed in some dark, shapeless robe of rough fabric resembling burlap, from under which incredibly long, thin arms with gnarled joints and gray parchment skin were visible. The fingers were long, spider-like, with black, broken nails. I couldn't see the face. It was hidden in the deep shadow of a hood where some kind of darkness swirled. But I felt its gaze on me, intent, unblinking, full of inhuman coldness and curiosity. In one hand, it held an object resembling an old postal or railroad lantern. But instead of glass, it had some kind of murky, pearlescent film or membrane, behind which flowed a dim, flickering, sickly green light. This light cast ugly, dancing shadows on the shabby staircase walls, distorting space. And from this creature came a low, vibrating hum, like the sound of a transformer station or a swarm of large insects. This hum was felt not only by the ears, but by the whole body. I stood rooted to the spot, paralyzed by horror, unable to move or make a sound. My breathing caught, my heart seemed to stop, and then started beating with such frequency that it was ready to jump out of my chest. It had come. It was waiting for me here. Not on the street, but right at the exit from the basement. The creature slowly, as if with effort, raised its free hand, the one without the lantern, and extended it toward me. Long gray fingers with black nails moved in the air, as if beckoning me or demanding something. The gesture was slow, almost ritual, and then it dawned on me with chilling clarity. The key, the box, they were for it. The system was trying to dispense them, and I'd shut it down. It had to come get its own. The creature took one slow, gliding step toward me onto the stairway landing. It moved silently despite its size. The green light of the lantern fell directly on my face, causing sharp pain in my eyes. Hum became almost physically tangible, causing vibration in my chest and slight nausea. I felt the smell, the same one that came from the box. Dry earth and something else, like the smell of rotting leaves or stagnant water. Panic struck with new force, tearing me from my stupor. Self-preservation instinct screamed louder than horror. I sharply recoiled back into the dark pickup station room, slammed the heavy metal door in the creature's face, and frantically latched the lock from inside. Just as quickly slammed and locked the creaky bars, almost breaking the key in the lock. I pressed my back against the cold bars, breathing heavily, almost choking. My hands were shaking so much I could barely stand. From outside came a sound, a quiet, drawn-out screech, as if someone had run something sharp along the metal door from top to bottom. Then another. And then silence fell again, broken only by the vibrating hum that now seemed to penetrate through walls, floor, and ceiling. It was everywhere. I stood like that for several minutes, not daring to move away from the door, listening to every rustle. Then carefully, trying not to make noise, I looked through the peephole of the metal door. The stairway landing was empty. The dim bulb illuminated only bare concrete walls and steps leading upward. The creature had disappeared, but the hum hadn't stopped. It had become quieter, but it was somewhere nearby. Maybe it was still standing behind the door, invisible, or had found another way inside. I slowly, with horror, turned around, peering into the twilight of the pickup station hall. Emergency lighting picked out rows of faceless lockers from the darkness. And then I saw movement and heard a sound that made the hair on my head stand on end. One of the lockers in the middle row, number 15, the very one from which I'd taken the cursed key. Its door slowly, with a long, rusty creak, opened by itself, despite the system being completely de-energized. Then another opened, a 07, where the warm wooden box had lain. And another and another. Click, creak, click, screech, quiet, clang. Dozens of lockers throughout the hall began opening one after another, chaotically, randomly, as if something inside them was awakening and breaking free. Some opened completely, hitting neighboring doors with a bang. Others only slightly ajar, forming dark slits. Some revealed emptiness, but in others there was something. In the dim, flickering light of the emergency lamps, I couldn't make out exactly what, but I saw some dark, shapeless bundles, objects gleaming like wet things, vague organic forms, something resembling clots of slime or tangled hair. Objects whose geometry was wrong, distorted. From some lockers came thin streams of smoke or vapor smelling of the same rot and ozone. The hum was intensifying. Now it came not from outside. It came from everywhere, from the walls, from the floor, from the opening lockers themselves. It became louder, more intrusive, turning into a low-frequency vibration that pressed on the ears, causing nausea and dizziness. Other sounds joined the hum. Quiet scratching from inside the lockers, rustling like the movement of dry leaves or insects. Distant, barely distinguishable whispers, consisting of many voices merging into an incoherent chorus. I realized with horror that the pickup station had come alive. Or whatever lived here, in this basement, in this building, had finally awakened. Shutting down the system hadn't helped. On the contrary, it had perhaps only destroyed some barrier that contained this. I was trapped in the very center of something alien, ancient, and terrible that used modern technology as camouflage. I had to run. Immediately. before that thing returned from the staircase or found another entrance, or before something even more nightmarish crawled out of those open lockers. I rushed to the exit again, unlocked the bars, then the door, peeked outside. The staircase was empty. The hum was quieter here but still distinctly audible, pulsing in the very air. Up, faster, I commanded myself, trying not to panic completely. I burst onto the staircase and ran up the steps, jumping over 2 at a time, not looking back. Backpack pounded against my back. My heart hammered like crazy, threatening to burst from my chest. I expected to hear shuffling footsteps behind me any moment, or wheezing breathing, or see the flickering green light of the lantern from around the staircase turn. It seemed to me that somewhere below in the basement one of the doors slammed, but I didn't check. Here was the upper landing, the heavy entrance door leading outside. I threw my whole body against it, afraid it too would be locked or wouldn't give way. But it opened. Fresh night air, cool and clean, hit my face like salvation. I was outside. The sky was already noticeably lightening in the east. Dawn was breaking. The pre-dawn coolness brought me to my senses a bit, cleared my head. I slammed the basement door behind me, not caring whether it was locked or not. The main thing was to get away. I looked around. The deserted territory of Tech Corp, the gloomy gray building with dark windows, seemed like a sleeping monster. Wind rustled in the bare branches of old trees. Nobody. No hum was audible here, only silence and my own intermittent, convulsive breathing, and I ran. I ran away from that cursed place as fast as I could, not watching the road, jumping over potholes and puddles on the broken asphalt, until I burst onto that same road I'd walked along here a few hours ago, a whole eternity ago. I didn't stop until I reached a lit street where the first rare cars were already appearing, and people hurrying to work in warm jackets. Only there, among signs of returning normal, everyday life, did I allow myself to stop, bending over double and trying to catch my breath. My hands and legs were shaking so much I could barely stand. Circles swam before my eyes. I was alive. I had escaped. But part of me seemed to remain forever there, in that cold, humming basement. I never went near the Tech Corp building again. Even when I had to travel in that direction, I chose a different route, making a detour just to avoid seeing that gray hulk on the horizon. I never called Mr. Davidson, and he never called me either. My desperate texts remained unanswered. Maybe he knew what he was sending me into. Maybe the previous night operator had also fled, or hadn't fled. I didn't bother collecting my employment records or demanding payment for that single but longest and most terrifying night of my life. I simply erased that job from my biography and my memory as much as possible. What was it? I can't give a precise answer, and I don't want to know it. But now I'm convinced that Pickup Station wasn't an ordinary package collection point for online orders. It was something else. A place at the junction of worlds. A portal. A transfer point. Post office for entities or phenomena that shouldn't intersect with our reality, but somehow learn to use our systems for their needs. Lockers opening by themselves. Packages appearing from nowhere. The icy key with its insane pattern. The warm box with dust and the smell of decay. And what I glimpsed in other lockers before fleeing, those were objects intended not for people. Possibly artifacts. Possibly someone's remains. Or something even worse. Those customers, the dark shadow on the camera, the invisible visitor behind the door, the terrifying lanky creature with the green lantern, they came for their packages. Or maybe they themselves were packages. I accidentally found myself where I shouldn't have been. A night watchman at the border, an operator at a pickup point for the otherworldly. I almost became part of that system. Maybe if I hadn't fled, if I'd given the key and box to that creature, what would have happened then? Would other lockers have opened? Would other customers have come? Would that place have become a permanent portal? Or would a different fate have awaited me, to become one of those who breathe behind doors, or turn into the contents of one of the lockers? These thoughts still cause panic attacks and cold sweats. I try not to think about it, but memories of the dim green light, monotonous humming, icy key, and rows of spontaneously opening lockers are forever burned into my memory like scars. I know one thing for certain. I will never work a night shift again, especially in a quiet, secluded place, because silence can be different. Sometimes behind it hides something you're better off never meeting face to face, and some packages are better not received, and certainly never, ever delivered, especially if they're not listed in the system, especially if those who come for them aren't visible to cameras. I think the main character should have approached job selection more scrupulously, because working in a building where they gave some part to quick drop for a pickup station, well, that's too strange. And when there are security guards walking around upstairs, you have to ask, for what and to whom are you going to distribute packages if it's almost on the outskirts of the city? During the interview, he should have asked more questions, and the manager would most likely have given away the whole truth with his behavior. And I hope you don't get into such situations. Please give this story a thumbs up if you listen to it all the way to the end. That way, we'll know how many of us listen to it completely. And as always, I'm not saying goodbye, because we'll hear each other in the next terrifyingly interesting story. The raw November wind prowled down Industrial Avenue with the arrogance of a drunk veteran, hurling handfuls of icy rain into Marcus's face and slipping under the collar of his worn jacket, making him hunch his shoulders and quicken his pace. The streetlights were sparse and dim, snatching glimpses of wet asphalt riddled with black potholes, peeling facades of old row houses, and bare oak branches that looked like gnarled fingers. The town was dying slowly, not all at once, but gradually, quietly, like an old man in his sleep, dying to the soundtrack of water dripping from rusted gutters and this endlessly melancholy wind. Marcus was coming home from his shift, third day straight on his feet. First the factory, then a side job loading trucks at the night warehouse. His eyes were heavy, his ears rang with machinery noise, and his legs wobbled from exhaustion. He wanted only one thing: to reach his small house on the outskirts, lock the door tight, and collapse on the couch. Forget everything. Not think about bills, about his perpetually grim shift supervisor, about prospects as murky and joyless as this November evening. He turned into a narrow alley between two old brick buildings. There were no streetlights here at all, just dim light from scattered windows falling on the broken sidewalk in uneven rectangles. The wind died down here, but he could hear something else. A scraping sound, quiet, almost imperceptible, like someone scratching metal against metal somewhere nearby. Marcus stopped and listened. The sound came from the direction of the abandoned steel mill that loomed like an ugly silhouette at the end of the alley. Its brick smokestack, tall and crooked, pierced the low sky like a leper's finger. Probably rats, Marcus thought, though the sound was too rhythmic for rodents, or homeless people cutting metal. He adjusted his backpack strap and walked on, trying to ignore it. In this town, something was always scraping, dripping, or howling. Normal stuff. But the sound didn't stop. It followed him, growing louder then softer, changing pitch. Now it resembled a whisper, distorted and mechanical, as if someone was trying to speak through old radio static. Marcus spun around sharply. Nothing, just wet walls, dark windows, and dancing shadows cast by the wind. His heart began beating faster. Just fatigue, he thought. I'm starting to hallucinate. He cursed under his breath and shook his head. Get it together, you wimp. He had almost reached his front door when he heard it again. This time clearer. A voice, or rather, a parody of a voice. Thin, rattling, as if recorded on an old cassette and played on dying batteries. The voice came from somewhere above, from the roof of his own house. Marcus looked up. Against the leaden sky, nothing was visible except the edge of the roof covered with something like tar and protruding rusty antennas. But that voice, it was eerily familiar. That's how his mother Linda used to speak, who had died 5 years ago. That same slightly creaky timbre, that same slight lisp on the letter R, but distorted, stretched like slow-motion film. Marcus, help me. Cold blood froze in his veins. This couldn't be a hallucination. It was too real, too targeted. Fear, cold and sticky, crawled up his spine. He covered the remaining distance in 2 leaps, reached his front door, and yanked the heavy metal door. The lock was jammed. Damn it, he frantically searched his pockets for keys, his fingers not obeying, trembling. Marcus, don't leave, rasped from above. The sound became louder, closer, as if whatever was speaking had leaned down from the roof, peering into the back of his head. Finally, the key was found. Wrong one. Another one. Here it is. Marcus forcefully turned it in the lock. The lock clicked. He jerked the door toward himself and flew into the hallway that smelled of nightmares and dampness. Slammed the door so hard that the glass in the frames shook, and leaned against it with his back, breathing heavily. His heart was pounding frantically in his chest, echoing with rumbles in his ears. Silence. Only his own breathing and the monotonous dripping of water somewhere on the upper floors. Outside, the howl of wind and the sound of rain. No voices. He slowly slid down the door and sat on the cold concrete floor. What was that? Mass hallucination. Someone's cruel joke with a speaker. But how would they know his name? And that voice, Mom's voice. Marcus clutched his head in his hands. He wasn't crazy. At least, he hadn't thought so until tonight. He was working himself to death, sleeping little, eating poorly. Maybe his mind had snapped from overwork. That seemed like the most logical explanation, the most desirable one, because the alternative was much scarier. The thought that something on the roof was imitating his dead mother's voice made him nauseous. What could it be? And why had it chosen him? He forced himself to get up, dusted off his pants. He needed to get home. Hot tea, shower, sleep. Tomorrow everything would look different, just nerves giving out. He made himself climb the stairs, trying not to look at the shabby walls with faded graffiti and not listen to the rustling. Every creak of a step, every gust of wind outside the stairwell window made him flinch. He opened the door to his apartment quickly, almost without breathing, flew inside, slammed it shut, locked all the locks. The apartment was quiet and dark, smelling of dust and something sour. Seemed like yesterday's soup was starting to spoil. Marcus flicked the switch in the hallway. The bulb blinked a couple of times and lit up with dim yellow light. He went to the kitchen, put the kettle on the stove. His hands were still shaking slightly. His gaze fell on the window. It faced the yard, toward that same abandoned steel mill. Now its smokestack seemed especially ominous against the dark sky. He tightly drew the curtains, old and faded with a stupid sunflower pattern. The kettle whistled. Marcus poured boiling water into a mug, threw in a bag of the cheapest tea, sat at the table, wrapped his palms around the hot mug. The warmth was somewhat calming. He took a sip, and then from the window right nearby, that scraping whisper sounded again. "Open up, Marcus." Marcus froze. Tea nearly spilled from the mug. The sound wasn't coming from the street. It was coming from the ventilation grate under the kitchen ceiling, the same one that connected his apartment to the building's general ventilation system. He slowly raised his head. The grate was old, rusty around the edges. From the darkness behind it seemed to seep cold and this sound. It was quiet, barely audible, but that made it even more terrifying, as if someone had pressed against the other end of the ventilation duct and was whispering directly into his apartment. "I'm here, Marcus." No, this can't be, Marcus thought. It's just a draft or neighbors making noise. Marcus jumped up, knocking over the stool. He grabbed a kitchen knife from the table, old with a shaky wooden handle. Not because he was going to fight the voice from the ventilation, just to have something to grip in his hand, so he wouldn't feel so helpless. He approached the wall under the grate and listened. Silence. Only the humming of the refrigerator and the beating of his own heart. Imagined it again. He stood like that for several minutes, peering into the dark slits of the grate, gripping the knife. Nothing. Maybe it really is just nerves. He slowly lowered the knife, tried to take a deep breath, but the air stuck in his throat. He needed to go to bed urgently. Sleep would sort everything out. He went to the bedroom without turning off the light, collapsed on the couch without undressing, covered himself head to toe with a scratchy blanket, closed his eyes, trying to drive his mother's voice out of his head, distorted, dead, whispering from the darkness. But sleep wouldn't come. Every rustle in the apartment, every sound from the street made him flinch, and that chilling whisper mixed with the screech of metal, knowing his name, still rang in his ears. The night passed in torn, anxious half-sleep. Marcus felt like he never really fell asleep. Every creak of floorboards, howling of wind in pipes, distant barking of dogs, all of it echoed in his head with multiplied force, interweaving with memories of the terrible whisper from the ventilation. His mother's voice, distorted, calling. He woke up several times, breaking out in cold sweat, listening to the silence of the apartment. But nothing else happened. Either it was hiding, or it really was just the fruit of his exhausted imagination. Morning greeted him with the same grayness as yesterday. The sky was covered with a thick blanket of clouds. Fine, annoying rain was drizzling. The apartment was cold, the radiators barely warm. Marcus brewed strong coffee, drank it in one gulp, burning himself. He needed to do something. Go to work after such a night. He could barely stand. Call someone. His hand automatically reached for the old push-button phone. The only person he could share this madness with without risking being labeled completely insane was Tyler, his childhood friend, neighbor from the garages. Tyler worked at an auto shop, always reeked of diesel and motor oil, and approached all of life's strangeness with philosophical indifference. "Hello," came a familiar hoarse voice from the receiver. In the background, he could hear the clank of metal and a running engine. "Tyler, hi, it's Marcus. You're not too busy?" "Marcus, hey. Yeah, as usual, tinkering around. What's up? Your voice sounds weird, like you're talking to a funeral director." Marcus smirked grimly. "Almost guessed it. Yeah, so listen, something happened yesterday. I don't even know how to explain it." "Well, don't keep me in suspense. Did you fight with Jenny from 3rd Street again, or did they want to raise your rent?" "Worse, Tyler, Much worse. Marcus lowered his voice, though he was alone in the apartment. Yesterday I heard my dead mother's voice, right by the house, and then from the ventilation. Silence hung in the receiver for several seconds, broken only by the noise of the workshop. So, Marcus, Tyler began carefully, when did you last sleep normally? And you didn't drink anything strong yesterday, did you? No, I didn't drink, and I slept, well, badly the last few days. Work's been killing me. But this wasn't a hallucination, Tyler. I heard it clearly. It called my name. You say your mother's voice. Tyler was quiet again. You know, my grandmother used to tell stories about all kinds of spirits that lure people with relatives' voices, especially in bad weather, near abandoned places. And you've got that steel mill nearby. Cursed place. Marcus hadn't expected this from pragmatic Tyler. You seriously think it's that? Hell if I know, Marcus, Tyler returned to his usual tone. Maybe it's nerves, maybe it's really some devilry that's moved in. Look, finish up whatever you're doing and come by the garages around 4. We'll sit, have some beer, you'll tell me everything properly. Plus you'll get out. You're sitting alone in your den. That's why all this crap gets in your head. All right, Marcus exhaled with relief. Thanks, Tyler, don't mention it. See you tonight. The conversation with Tyler calmed him down a bit. Just the thought that he wasn't alone, that there was someone who would at least listen without tapping their temple, gave him strength. He decided not to go to his second job today. Called in, lied about having a fever. He needed to pull himself together. The rest of the day dragged painfully slowly. Marcus wandered around the apartment, mechanically wiped dust, washed dishes, even tried to read, but the letters blurred before his eyes. He kept listening to the ventilation, but no sound came from there. Just ordinary household noises. Humming of the refrigerator, ticking of old wall clocks. Closer to 4, he dressed warmly and went outside. The rain had almost stopped, but the sky remained low and heavy. It was about 15 minutes' walk to the garage cooperative, past that same steel mill. Marcus quickened his pace as he passed its black windows and tall smokestack. He felt like something was watching him from the darkness. He tried not to look back. The garages greeted him with the smell of dampness, gasoline, and rotting leaves. Tyler's was at the very end of the row. The door was ajar, quiet country music, and light from a portable lamp came from inside. Tyler, Marcus called. Come in, it's not locked, his friend responded from inside. Inside it was cramped and relatively warm, smelling of motor oil and tobacco. Tools, spare parts, and canisters were scattered everywhere. In the middle stood a disassembled Chevy that Tyler was tinkering under. Nearby on the workbench were 2 bottles of beer and a bag of chips. Have a seat, Tyler nodded toward an old car seat by the wall. Just let me tighten this bolt. Marcus sat down. In the familiar garage atmosphere, among the smells of iron and gasoline, the evening horror seemed a bit less real. Tyler crawled out from under the car, wiping his hands with a rag. He looked as usual, a bit tired but calm and confident. Well, tell me, he said, handing Marcus an open bottle of beer. What kind of ghost opera have you got going? Marcus took a big gulp of cold beer and began to tell. He tried to speak calmly, sequentially, not missing details. About the scraping at the mill, about his mother's voice from the roof, about the whisper from the ventilation. Tyler listened silently, frowning, sometimes nodding. When Marcus finished, Tyler remained silent for some time, staring somewhere into the corner of the garage. "Yeah," he finally said, "that's a messed up story, especially about your mother's voice. That's not joking matter, brother." "That's what I'm saying," Marcus exclaimed. "This couldn't have been a dream or seemed like one." "All right, don't panic. Look, I believe you heard something. The question is, what did you hear? Maybe someone's really pranking you. Kids these days are sick. They watch too many prank videos. Or," Tyler lowered his voice again, "or my grandmother was right. That steel mill, there were always rumors about it. They say workers died during construction, and then night watchmen disappeared. Bad place. Maybe something's crawling out of there." "What's crawling out?" Marcus asked, feeling a chill run down his spine again. "Hell knows. Some entity, restless spirit, ghost of the past, call it what you want. It feeds on fear, takes the form of what you're afraid of or miss. Imitates voices. Classic stuff." "So what do I do?" Marcus looked at his friend hopefully. "First, calm down. If it's a one-time hallucination or someone's joke, it won't happen again. If it's something else, it'll show itself again. Main thing is not to panic, and block that ventilation of yours. Seal it up tight. No telling what might come through there." "You think I should go there, to the mill?" Tyler shook his head. "I don't recommend it. And what would you see there? Ruins and trash. If there's something there, it hides during the day, and going at night is suicide. Let's do this. If this repeats, call me immediately, anytime. We'll figure something out together. Maybe we'll go look, but prepared. With flashlights, crowbar. But for now, sit tight, be alert, and block that ventilation." They finished their beer and sat in silence. Tyler's pragmatic attitude mixed with acceptance of something inexplicable affected Marcus in two ways. On one hand, he was glad he wasn't being mocked. On the other, the words about entities and cursed places only increased his anxiety. "All right, I'm going," Marcus said, getting up. "Thanks, Tyler, for listening. Don't mention it. Come by if anything happens. And don't mope around. We'll get through this." Marcus nodded and left the garage. It was completely dark outside. He walked past the steel mill again, but now fear mixed with some strange, morbid curiosity. What was there? What kind of ghost of the past that knew his name and spoke in his mother's voice? He had almost reached his house when he caught movement in one of the dark windows of the mill on the second floor out of the corner of his eye. He stopped abruptly and peered. Nothing, just play of light and shadow. And then he heard a sound, not a voice, a different sound, quiet, barely distinguishable, crying, a child's crying. It came from there, from the darkness of the abandoned building. The crying was pitiful, heart-wrenching, it tore at his soul. Marcus froze, unable to move. Part of him screamed, "Run!" Another part, hypnotized by this sound, wanted to come closer, find out who was crying there, help. The crying suddenly stopped. Ringing silence fell, broken only by the noise of wind. Marcus stood in the middle of the street, his heart pounding like crazy. A child's crying, another imitation, another lure. He realized Tyler was right. This wasn't an accident, and it wasn't going to leave him alone. Returning to the apartment, Marcus first locked the door with all the locks, including the chain. His hands shook slightly after hearing the child's crying by the mill. That sound was even more disgusting than his mother's distorted voice. The first scared him, but this caused a nauseating feeling of wrongness, unnaturalness, as if someone was pulling the deepest strings of his soul with rusty pliers. Tyler's advice about the ventilation now seemed like the only right decision. He needed to isolate himself from this nightmare, block the source of the terrible sounds. He went to the kitchen. His gaze involuntarily darted to the grate under the ceiling. Now it looked ominous, like a dark eye watching him. Silence, but tense, expectant silence. Marcus felt like a mouse in a predator's crosshairs. He didn't have spray foam. Going to the store now again past the mill. No way. He needed to improvise. He rummaged through an old closet in the hallway where all kinds of junk was stored. Found a stack of some ancient rags, seemed like remnants of his grandmother's old clothes. Dusty, smelling of mothballs but dense, would work. He also needed tape. He found an almost empty roll of wide gray duct tape that he once used to seal windows for winter. Armed with rags and tape, he dragged a shaky stool to the kitchen, placed it under the grate. His heart began beating faster again. He had to get close to the source of his fear. He forced himself to take a deep breath. Calm down. It's just a hole in the wall, just old ventilation. He stood on the stool. The grate was within arm's reach. The rust around the edges seemed wet and dark. The opening pulled with cold, a barely perceptible smell of mold or something else. Unfamiliar, sweet, and nauseating. Marcus took the largest rag and tried to stuff it into the grate. The metal slats were narrow, the rag wouldn't fit. He tried to fold it, and then from the depths of the ventilation duct came a quiet sound. Scraping, like what he heard yesterday at the mill. As if something sharp was scratching metal from inside. Marcus froze. The stool swayed under his leg. A quiet, barely audible whisper came directly from the grate, just inches from his face. Don't, the voice was unclear, as if assembled from different sounds, but it contained notes of Tyler's voice. Don't close it, Marcus. Marcus jerked back so sharply he almost fell off the stool. He jumped to the floor, stepped back several steps, not taking his eyes off the grate. The tape and rags fell to the floor. "Is that you, Tyler?" he asked stupidly into the void, understanding the absurdity of the question. From the grate came scraping again, and then a quiet giggling sound. Disgusting, gurgling laughter that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. It's mocking me, Marcus realized. It knows about Tyler. It heard our conversation, or it reads minds. Fear was replaced by angry determination. Enough. He wouldn't let this creature terrorize him in his own home. He picked up the rags again. This time, he didn't try to stuff them inside. He decided to simply cover the grate from the outside as much as possible. He got back on the stool. His hands were shaking, but he forced himself to act. Spread one rag, applied it to the grate. With his other hand began frantically unwinding the tape. "It hurts," hissed from behind the rag. "Can't breathe." The sound was weak, muffled, but still pierced to the bone. Marcus tried not to listen. He stuck the tape crosswise, strip after strip, over the rag, pressing it against the wall. The gray tape lay unevenly, wrinkled, but held. Suddenly from behind the rag came a strong icy draft, almost wind. The rag swelled, stretched, as if something from inside was trying to push it out. The tape cracked. "Go away," Marcus shouted, not expecting such volume from himself. His voice broke. "Get out of here, you freak." He pressed the rag with force with his hand, simultaneously trying to apply another layer of tape. The draft was unnaturally strong and cold. It seemed like winter itself was breathing in his face from this damned hole. and suddenly everything stopped. The wind died down, the sounds disappeared. Complete silence fell. The rag hung limply under the tape. Marcus froze, listening. Nothing, absolutely nothing. He slowly removed his hand. The rag stayed in place, tightly pressed by several layers of tape to the wall. The grate was closed, unreliably, crudely, but closed. He got down from the stool. His legs were like cotton. He examined his work. It looked ugly, a gray patch on the dirty kitchen wall. But the main thing was quiet. He stood in the kitchen for another 10 minutes, listening. No whisper, no scraping. Could it be? Could he have managed to at least temporarily cut himself off from this horror? He felt wild fatigue, but also some strange satisfaction. He didn't just get scared and run away. He fought back, even if just by sealing a hole with a rag. He put away the stool, picked up the fallen rags, went to the bedroom, still listening to the walls. They no longer seemed ominous, rather empty, ordinary. Maybe Tyler was right. Maybe it really was some entity tied to the place, to the mill, and the ventilation was just a channel through which it could reach him. And by blocking the channel, he deprived it of the ability to influence him here, in the apartment. This thought calmed him somewhat, but the main question remained. What was this thing, and why did it choose him? And what would it do now that one of its access routes was blocked? Marcus understood this wasn't the end, rather, just the beginning. He had won a small respite, but not the battle. Now it knew he was resisting, and it might look for other ways. He approached the window, carefully moved the curtain aside, looked at the dark silhouette of the mill. Was it his imagination, or was one of the windows on the second floor glowing with a weak, dim light, as if someone had lit a candle or flashlight there? He quickly closed the curtain. Enough for today. He needed rest. He needed to try to sleep. He lay in bed, listening to the silence. Marcus didn't feel safe. The sealed ventilation seemed like unreliable protection, and the image of the dark mill with a lonely light in the window stood before his eyes. It was there, it was waiting, and it would definitely return. The silence that settled after he sealed the ventilation seemed deceptive. It didn't bring peace. On the contrary, it became another form of torture. Before, fear had a source, a dark hole in the wall from which whispers seeped. Now, when it was plugged with a makeshift stopper of rags and tape, fear spread throughout the apartment, soaking into the air, settling on things, hiding in shadows. Marcus almost stopped sleeping. If he fell into a doze, it was briefly. He jerked awake at any sound. A floorboard creaked in the hallway, footsteps of neighbors upstairs, or had it found another way? A rustle outside the window, wind, or someone scratching the glass. Every sound passed through a filter of paranoia, becoming a harbinger of threat. He began to notice strangeness, where he used to see only the mundane. The reflection in the dark screen of the turned-off TV. For a second it seemed like someone was standing behind his back. The shadow of the coat rack in the hallway. Why did it look so much like a hunched figure? The water dripping from the kitchen faucet. Didn't this rhythm form some word? He lost weight. Dark circles appeared under his eyes. His movements became sharp, jerky. He checked the locks on the front door and windows several times a night, approached the sealed ventilation, listened, touched the rag. Was there a draft? Hadn't it come off? The silence from there seemed unnatural, ringing. The thought of calling Tyler came up, but he pushed it away. What would he say? That he was seeing shadows and hearing talking water drops. After he sealed the ventilation, there were no direct messages from the creature. Tyler would think he had finally gone completely crazy from lack of sleep. And worse, that he would come here and this thing would switch to him. No, he couldn't risk Tyler. This was his fight. He almost stopped leaving the house except for work. The factory was the only thing that kept him from completely drowning in the abyss of fear. It forced him to interact with reality, with other people, and the noise of the workshop drowned out any rustles and whispers. But as soon as the shift ended, he almost ran home to his fortress, which increasingly resembled a trap. He started looking for information. First, just general information about the area, about this damned mill. The old laptop took a long time to load. The internet worked slowly. He typed into the search engine the street name, house number, abandoned steel mill. There was little information. Standard news about utility problems, a couple of articles about demolition plans for the mill that were never implemented. Nothing about disappearances, deaths, or strange incidents that Tyler had mentioned. But Marcus dug deeper. He started searching old city forums, abandoned groups on social networks. And there, among discussions of fishing, politics, and complaints about utilities, he stumbled upon a thread from 10 years ago. It was simply called Strange Sounds at the Old Steel Mill. His heart started pounding. He stared at the screen. Several anonymous users shared stories. Someone heard crying at night. Someone heard scraping metal. One wrote about voices calling by name. Another mentioned that his dog refused to approach this place, whined and pressed against his legs. There were skeptics who blamed everything on wind in pipes, homeless people, or their own imagination. But the coincidences were too obvious, especially a message from a user with the nickname Engineer78. Strange things happened there from the very construction. They say during testing of the steel furnaces, something went wrong. There was a release of molten metal under enormous pressure. Several people were literally cooked alive. Not all bodies were found. And then, when it was already operating, the acoustics there were strange. In some workshops, echoes wandered so that voices were distorted beyond recognition, as if the walls themselves were talking. We climbed there as kids in the 90s, when it was already abandoned. It was creepy. Once we heard someone calling by name, and there wasn't a soul around. Never went there again. Cooked alive, echo-distorting voices, calling by names. Marcus felt a cold sweat run down his back. This was it, not just a story. Something really happened there. And this ghost of the past, as Tyler said, apparently never left. It remained there in the walls of the old mill, and now it had gotten out. Or it could always reach the nearest houses through old communications, like ventilation. The information didn't bring relief. On the contrary, knowledge made the threat more real, more tangible. This wasn't just unexplained horror, but something with its own terrible history. This history was connected to sound, to distortion, to voices. Now the mill attracted him even more. He understood it was dangerous, insane, but the thought that answers, or at least understanding of the nature of this horror, were there, wouldn't let go. What was this ghost? Spirits of the dead, or something else, born from tragedy and acoustic anomalies of the place? Marcus again approached the window, carefully moved the curtain aside. The mill loomed in the pre-dawn twilight. The light in the window was no longer burning, but Marcus felt like the entire building was looking at him, waiting, calling. He began to think about a plan, how to get in there, what to take with him, flashlights, something heavy, A crowbar, as Tyler suggested. Maybe try to record sounds on the voice recorder of his old phone. This obsession pushed out fear. Or rather, fear didn't go anywhere. It just transformed into feverish, almost manic desire to face the threat head-on. To learn it, maybe even destroy it. Although how can you destroy a distorted sound, stuck in time? He caught his reflection in the dark window glass. Pale, exhausted face, burning eyes. He didn't recognize himself. That tired, apathetic Marcus, who just a few days ago only dreamed of sleep and peace, had disappeared. In his place was someone else. Hunted, frightened, but ready to go to the end. Because he understood. Just sitting and waiting in this apartment meant allowing fear to devour him from within. And going there, to the lair of the creature, was a chance. A chance to either die or, he didn't know what. But it was better than slowly fading away in the web of his own fear. The decision was made. There was no retreat. But he couldn't go alone. Marcus remembered Tyler's words. If this repeats, call me immediately. Well, it didn't just repeat. It had settled in his head, taken root in his fears. He dialed his friend's number again. The beep stretched painfully long. Yeah, Tyler's voice sounded wary. Apparently, Marcus's intonation last time had gotten to him after all. Tyler, I dug up some stuff about the mill, about voices. Looks like it's not hallucinations and not jokes. And what's there? Tyler asked without his usual skepticism. Marcus quickly told about what he found on the forum. About the accident, the dead, the strange acoustics, and stories about calling voices. I'm going there, Tyler, he said firmly. Today, right now, I can't sit here anymore and wait. Alone, Tyler asked after a pause. Yeah. Well, you're nuts, Marcus, Tyler sighed. All right, wait for me at your front door in 15 minutes. You're not going there alone. I'll grab flashlights and some serious iron. Wrenches. Marcus felt enormous relief mixed with guilt for dragging his friend into this. Thanks, Tyler. Too late to thank me now. Get dressed warm. It's probably freezing in there. 15 minutes later, Tyler was there. A heavy adjustable wrench was visible under his unbuttoned jacket, tucked behind his belt. In his hand, he held two powerful flashlights. He looked serious and focused, ready for anything. Ready? Tyler asked grimly. Ready? Marcus nodded, taking one of the flashlights. Silently, shoulder to shoulder, they moved toward the looming silhouette of the mill. The wind had died down, and in the silence, their steps on the wet asphalt seemed deafeningly loud. The closer they got, the stronger the oppressive feeling became, as if the building itself was pressing down on them with its mass and dark history. They found an unlocked side door, rusted and hanging crooked. With a strained screech, it gave way. From inside came a smell of mustiness, dampness, and something else. That same sweet and nauseating smell that Marcus had caught at the ventilation grate. What a resort, Tyler muttered, directing his flashlight beam inside. They found themselves in a huge empty room. High ceilings disappeared into darkness. Flashlight beams snatched glimpses of rusty stairs, intertwining pipes, remains of some equipment covered with a thick layer of dust and dirt. Water dripped from the ceiling, and each drop echoed with multiple reflections wandering somewhere under the vaults. You heard about the accident. Where could it have been? Marcus whispered. His voice also echoed, distorted and unpleasant. Most likely in the main hall where the furnaces stood, Tyler whispered back. Let's go there, but carefully. They moved deeper into the building, trying to step quieter. The echo of their steps followed them, but sometimes it lagged or doubled or merged with strange rustling like interference. "You hear that?" Marcus asked. "I hear," Tyler answered tensely. "Bad acoustics, or not just acoustics." They entered the room that was apparently the main foundry hall. Huge, rusty hulks of furnaces rose in the center like ancient idols. Debris was scattered everywhere, pieces of metal, broken glass. In the far corner gaped a hole in the wall from which an icy draft pulled. And then they heard it. The whisper. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once. Multiple voices merging into an incomprehensible hum in which sometimes individual words could be caught. "Help, cold, Marcus, Tyler. Here, lies." The flashlight beams trembled in their hands. "What the hell?" Tyler shouted, but his voice drowned in the growing chorus of whispering voices. "It's the ghost," Marcus yelled. The whisper became louder, more insistent. It pressed on their ears, penetrated their heads. Familiar voices began to be heard. Marcus's mother's voice, the same female voice that Tyler seemed to recognize and turned pale. Children's crying. The sounds layered on each other, creating a cacophony of madness. "Marcus, let's get out of here." Tyler grabbed Marcus by the sleeve, but Marcus was staring at one of the furnaces. On its surface, through the rust, dark melted stains were visible. There. It happened there. "Come here, Marcus. It's warm here," whispered his mother's voice directly in his ear. Marcus felt an irresistible desire to approach, look inside the furnace. But Tyler forcefully jerked him back. "Don't listen, it's a trap." At that moment, something crashed down from above with a deafening screech. A huge piece of rusty pipe fell where they had been standing a second before. Dust rose. The whisper suddenly stopped, replaced by a piercing, inhuman howl that seemed to come from the walls of the building itself. The sound was so powerful that it made their ears ring, causing physical pain. "Run," Tyler yelled, dragging Marcus toward the exit. They ran, stumbling in the darkness, to the accompaniment of this terrifying howl. The building seemed to come alive, creaking, groaning, seeing them off. They burst outside into the night air, gasping, deafened. The howl abruptly stopped. It became quiet again, only their own heavy breathing and heartbeat. They turned around. The mill stood as before, dark and silent. No sounds. They walked away to a safe distance and stopped. "You okay?" Tyler asked, breathing heavily. "Alive, I think," Marcus exhaled. His ears were still ringing. "We barely got our legs out of there. What was that, damn it?" Marcus looked at the mill. It no longer seemed like just an abandoned building. It was alive, wounded, angry. "I don't know, Tyler, the ghost, the remains of those who died there, or something that pretends to be them. It's there. It hasn't gone anywhere." They stood for a while longer, silently looking at the dark building. Then they slowly walked away. Neither wanted to talk about it anymore. Not now. They had survived. They had gotten out. But something had changed. Marcus felt it. The silence was no longer empty. Now it was filled with knowledge. Knowledge of what was hiding in the darkness, very close by. And this knowledge, like the distorted sounds in the walls of the old mill, would stay with him forever. He had looked into the heart of the ghost, and it had looked into him. And whose voice he would hear next time when the wind howled in the wires or a floorboard creaked, he didn't know. "We need to get out, Marcus. Get out of town before it gets us," Tyler said quietly as they walked away from the mill. Marcus nodded. The encounter had shown them both that some things were beyond their understanding or ability to fight. The mill held secrets that were meant to stay buried, and they had been lucky to escape with their lives. As they reached Marcus's house, both men stood in the pale streetlight, forever changed by what they had witnessed. The mill loomed behind them, a dark reminder that some places are meant to remain untouched, and some voices should never be answered. The industrial town felt different now. Every shadow could hide something sinister, every wind could carry whispers from the past. Marcus looked at his small house, knowing that even with the ventilation sealed, he would never feel truly safe again. Some hauntings don't end with dawn. Some echoes never fade. And in places where tragedy has soaked into the very walls, the dead don't always rest easy. The mill would remain, waiting in the darkness, ready to call out to the next unfortunate soul who dared to listen too closely to its ancient, terrible song. The raw November night wrapped around Greenwood Cemetery like a suffocating shroud, thick fog rolling in from the nearby marsh, and settling between the weathered headstones and crumbling mausoleums. The few working streetlights that still flickered along the main cemetery road cast sickly yellow pools of light on the wet asphalt and soggy fallen leaves, their glow more menacing than illuminating. The pale illumination caught glimpses of sorrowful stone angels with broken wings, tilted crosses, and moss-covered slabs etched with half-erased names and dates from centuries past. Wind caught in the bare, twisted branches of ancient oak and weeping willow trees, howling mournfully like a choir of restless spirits, and each gust brought with it the icy breath of autumn. The heavy, rotten smell of decomposing leaves and earth mixed with that barely detectable, nauseating stench of decay that seemed embedded in the very air of this place of the dead. In the distance, a crow cawed hoarsely and harshly, the sound sharp and disturbing like a bad omen, making Jake, a young man of 22 with a pale, gaunt face, nervously shudder and pull his old, worn jacket tighter around himself. A jacket that barely protected him from the bone-chilling cold. He cast a quick, hunted glance into the darkness, where among the graves he thought he saw some movement. Tommy, his partner, a man about 10 years older with a weathered face lined with small wrinkles, and tired, slightly squinting eyes, in which all youthful enthusiasm had long since died, only chuckled quietly upon noticing Jake's unease. He was used to such nights, to this oppressive, almost tangible silence broken only by the scraping of their shovels, their own labored breathing, and the distant hum of the sleeping town. For Tommy, the cemetery had long ceased to be a place of grief and mystical dread. This was his job, his grim gold mine, a source of dirty but quick and most importantly tax-free money. He had long learned not to pay attention to the oppressive atmosphere and his own fears, though somewhere deep in his soul, behind a thick layer of cynicism, something resembling a superstitious chill sometimes stirred. "Don't be such a baby," Tommy growled, spitting on the freshly dug earth, clods of which fell with a dull thud on the coffin lid. "Dead folks don't bite, they've done their suffering. It's the living you gotta worry about, especially those with badges and nightsticks, or those who wouldn't mind helping themselves to someone else's goods." He glanced at Jake, who was still looking around nervously. "Or those whose nerves are too weak, you can't count on them either." They stood at a freshly excavated grave from which just a couple of days ago, to the monotonous mumbling of a priest and the fake sobbing of inconsolable relatives, came the sounds of a funeral orchestra. Now this place was dominated by them night scavengers, marauders with shovels, hunters for other people's goods, which in their cynical conviction the dead no longer needed, but the living could really use. In the light of Tommy's dim headlamp, the beam of which nervously darted around, a lacquered coffin gleamed, still not having had time to tarnish. Its lid had been roughly torn from its hinges and carelessly thrown aside, exposing the dark maw of the grave pit. "Well, what's in there, Tommy? Find anything good?" Jake's voice trembled with impatience, poorly concealed fear, and cold. He tried not to look toward the dark pit of the grave, where the silhouette of the deceased could dimly be made out in the folds of expensive silk. But greed, that eternal companion of such trades, overcame both squeamishness and superstitious horror. Before his eyes, stacks of crisp bills and the gleam of gold were already forming a new life. Tommy silently rummaged in the coffin, his hands in thick, dirty work gloves skillfully and quickly, almost by touch, feeling around the body of the deceased, checking pockets, fingers, neck. He did this with the mundane efficiency of a pathologist long accustomed to the sight of death. Finally, he straightened up, and in the flashlight beam, gold glinted predatorily. "Not bad," he said with satisfaction, and notes of triumph slipped into his voice. The old boy wasn't buried for nothing with such pomp. Gold chain, about 3 ounces, no less. He shook the massive gold chain whose links gleamed dully. Signet rings with stones, solid ones. He removed 2 heavy rings from the deceased's fingers, and the wallets in place plump with cash. Not millions, of course, but enough to pay off debts and not think about daily bread for a couple weeks. He handed Jake the heavy, cold gold chain and 2 massive rings. Jake's eyes, frightened until that moment, immediately lit up with an unhealthy, greedy fire. Instantly forgetting his fear, he put the chain around his neck, feeling its pleasant weight, twirled the rings in front of him, estimating their value on the black market. His face spread into a satisfied smirk. "Now that's what I'm talking about," he breathed admiringly, his voice immediately growing stronger. "This is what I understand. And you were saying, Tommy, that fresh jobs are risky relatives might show up, or security. But here such wealth just floats into our hands." "Risky doesn't mean unprofitable," Tommy didn't argue, stuffing the stack of bills extracted from the wallet into the inner pocket of his well-worn jacket. "If you approach it smart and don't stick your neck out. The main thing is information and speed. And this, Jake," he looked meaningfully at his partner, "is just the beginning, a warm-up, so to speak. I've got a tip on another spot. Older, of course, but they say no less fat, maybe even fatter, if we're lucky." He quickly, without unnecessary fuss, threw dirt back on the coffin, and somehow managed to put the torn wreath back in place, trying to make the grave look as if no one had disturbed it, though who really cared about this authority figure now? Jake, still fingering his lute, feeling the cold metal, was burning with curiosity. What kind of place? Another businessman who didn't make it, or some gangster from the 90s? More interesting, Tommy grinned, wiping his dirty hands on the dusty side of his palm. Older. Remember old Bill, the former gravedigger? You know, the one who's always hanging around the liquor store, bumming money for a hangover, telling stories for a drink. Jake nodded. Everyone in their semi-criminal circles knew old Bill, and not only them. An old, almost completely drunk man with a swollen red face and shaking hands. He had once actually worked at this very cemetery, back in the 1970s. For a bottle of cheap vodka or a couple $100, he could tell many interesting things from the cemetery kitchen. And sometimes, if you were really lucky and approached it right, even give you a profitable tip point to an abandoned grave of some wealthy, but long forgotten by relatives deceased. True, lately his stories on vodka were becoming increasingly dubious, often frankly delirious. But sometimes, even among the chaff, there were grains of truth. So Tommy continued, lighting a cheap cigarette and releasing a ring of smoke into the damp air, which immediately dissolved in the fog. I treated him yesterday, bought a couple bottles, took some sausage, bread. We got to talking. The old man was hesitant at first, making excuses, saying everything worthwhile had long been dug up. But then, when the third bottle started flowing, his tongue loosened up and he told me a story. Or maybe not a story, hell knows. You decide for yourself. Tommy paused, letting Jake digest the information. Jake listened with bated breath, eyes wide. The story intrigued him, tickled his nerves, though it also gave off some kind of rot and devilry that made him uneasy. He says there's a spot here in the old, completely abandoned section, where no one's been for 100 years or more. Everything's overgrown with waist-high grass, crosses rotted away, headstones sunk into the ground. Buried there back in 1880-something was some eccentric, not quite a gentleman, not quite a common man, but well off, with big oddities. A collector of old dolls or some kind of human-like mannequins. And not just a collector, but completely nuts. He was into all sorts of devilry, ordered books on black magic, conducted rituals, tried to bring his soulless toys to life, breathe souls into them. You get it, the guy's roof completely caved in on that basis. Tommy paused, giving Jake time to process the information. Jake listened with bated breath, eyes wide open. The story was intriguing, nerve-tickling, though it also reeked of something rotten and devilish that made him uncomfortable. And what does old Bill think? Does he have gold and diamonds buried at his feet? Jake asked doubtfully, trying to give his voice a skeptical note. But deep down, a spark of excitement was already igniting. An old burial that was always a chance to hit a really big jackpot. Old Bill swears that when they buried this collector, and they buried him quietly, almost secretly, at night, without extra eyes, they put something very valuable in the coffin with him. Either some old box forged with silver with family jewels, or some magical artifact that he guarded more than his own eyes while alive. Bill himself says he was just a kid when he heard this story from his grandfather, who also worked as a gravedigger at this same cemetery his whole life, devoted to the earth. Grandfather Bill secretly watched the funeral, hiding behind a crypt, saw them lowering something heavy and obviously expensive into the grave, wrapped in brocade. Grandfather got scared then, didn't climb down to check, and was afraid to mess with this collector. Too bad a reputation went around about him. They said he could take revenge even after death. And old Bill now, drunk, remembered details, even pointed out the approximate place. Says he'd go himself, but he's not the same anymore, and it's scary for him alone in such a place. Old Bill, telling his story, lowered his voice to a whisper, looking around as if afraid that the spirits of the old cemetery were eavesdropping. He even crossed himself several times, which for a drunkard was extremely uncharacteristic. He also mumbled something about how this collector didn't just collect dolls, He tried to create the perfect being from parts of different. Well, you get it. Creepy stuff, in short. But the main thing, valuable stuff, Jake, very valuable. The old man was literally drooling when he talked about it. Magic dolls and body parts, Jake shuddered. He felt genuinely uncomfortable. The gold chain around his neck suddenly seemed like an icy noose. Sounds kind of creepy, Tommy, really creepy. Maybe we should leave it alone. Who knows what's really there? What if there's nothing but bones and some curse? Or old Bill just had delirium tremens? Creepy or not creepy, but if there really is something valuable lying their family trinkets from the 1800s, that's a real fortune, Jake. Tommy cut him off. His eyes gleamed with determination in the darkness. For that kind of money, you can buy an apartment and a car and still have change left over. Gold was gold in the 19th century, and it's still valuable now. And all these fairy tales about magic and curses are for little kids and impressionable old ladies. We're tough guys, experienced, this stuff won't scare us, right? Or have you already shit your pants from grandfather's tales? He winked challengingly at Jake, and Jake, spurred by greed, the example of his older partner and reluctance to seem cowardly, nodded uncertainly. The prospect of getting even richer, hitting a jackpot that would change his entire gray, hopeless life, overshadowed all fears and drove away bad premonitions. All right, he agreed, trying to seem calm. When do we go? Just need to prepare better. The place is old, abandoned. Who knows what's waiting for us there? Tomorrow night, Tommy decided, throwing away his cigarette butt. While the tip is fresh and old Bill, sobering up, hasn't had time to sell it to someone else for an extra drink or change his mind. We'll take stronger shovels, a couple crowbars, more powerful flashlights. Old earth, it's hard as stone, compressed by time. We'll have to sweat, but the game's worth the candle, Jake, trust me. They left the cemetery through a hole in the old, half-collapsed brick fence, trying to stay in the shadows and not attract the attention of rare night passers-by or a random police patrol. The moon occasionally peeked through ragged, shaggy clouds, briefly illuminating their path along the deserted streets of the sleeping town. Ahead of them awaited another night full of risk, hard work, and possibly immortal treasures. Or something completely different that they didn't even suspect yet. Something that was already lurking in the age-old darkness of the old burial ground, patiently waiting for its new guests. Tommy tried not to think about the strange gleam in old Bill's eyes when he told about the collector. A gleam in which fear, excitement, and some kind of hidden, bad hope were mixed. The next day, Tommy, as promised, came for Jake closer to evening. Preparation for the night job was in full swing, though accompanied by nervous bustle from the younger partner. Jake, inspired by yesterday's success, which already seemed like an easy walk to him, and spurred by Tommy's stories about a possible treasure trove from a century ago, was rushing around his small, cluttered apartment, checking and double-checking equipment. 2 well-worn but sharp spade shovels, sharpened to a shine from the last time. A pair of powerful LED flashlights bought by chance at the local market from a cunning Chinese vendor. A coil of strong nylon rope, several pairs of gloves, a flask of water, and a thermos with hot tea. The standard kit of any black digger counting on a long and fruitful night. Tommy, what if there really is? Well, evil spirits or something. Jake tried to speak carelessly, going through the tools, but notes of poorly concealed anxiety were clearly audible in his voice. The past night, spent embracing the extracted gold, which he kept taking out of his hiding place under the mattress and recounting, hadn't completely dispelled the vague uneasiness that old Bill's story had planted in his soul. The image of the eccentric collector with his creepy dolls wouldn't leave his head. He even had a dream in which porcelain dolls with empty eye sockets reached their little hands toward him. Tommy, concentratedly checking the battery charge in his flashlight and changing them to fresh ones, just waved his hand without turning his head. "Again with your nonsense, Jake. How many times can we go over this? What evil spirits in our age of progress, internet, and spaceships? Fairy tales, that's all for impressionable young ladies and country fools. The most we're waiting for there is a couple dozen rotten boards, a pile of human dust, and maybe some fat rats. We're not filming a horror movie, after all, but going for real cash." However, despite his bravado, Tommy himself felt some inexplicable anxiety. Old Bill's story was too specific. Usually, old men told tales about buried merchant treasures or hidden white guard gold. But here, black magic, living dolls, and six-armed something. There was something about it that made even him, a seasoned cynic, slightly uncomfortable. He remembered how many years ago, still as a kid, he heard similar stories from his grandmother who lived in the countryside about sorcerers who could harm even after death those who disturbed their rest. Then he laughed, but now he just pushed these thoughts away. His show of confidence somewhat calmed Jake, but somewhere deep in his soul, in its darkest corner, a small, persistent worm of doubt and fear continued to scratch. The collector's creepy hobbies were described by old Bill too colorfully, with frightening details. The old man even claimed he saw one of the collector's toys, a small figure sewn from different pieces of leather, with sewn-on buttons instead of eyes, which he allegedly carried with him as a talisman. What if he really did animate his dolls? Jake persisted, lowering his voice to a whisper as if afraid the walls would hear him. "You know, conducted rituals used human blood." Tommy sighed heavily, put down his flashlight, and looked at his partner with a long, somewhat tired and slightly irritated gaze. "Listen, Jake, I've been prowling these cemeteries, you could say, since I was born. 15 years with my dad at night, then started on my own. I've seen everything, heard all kinds of stories. About vampires sucking blood from sleeping beauties. About werewolves howling at the moon. About ghosts of innocently murdered grandfathers wandering at night in white shrouds seeking revenge. Only in reality, all this turned out to be either the drunken ravings of guards who'd had too much, or the overheated imagination of random witnesses, or just the sound of wind in pipes. The only real danger there is running into a police patrol or colleagues like us, competitors who might hit you over the head for a good plot. Everything else is lyrics for the yellow press. The main thing is what you can dig up, pull out, and sell profitably. Got it? So get this crap out of your head and think about business." "Got it, Tommy, got it," Jake nodded quickly, trying not to anger his older partner with stupid questions and doubts anymore. However, the thought of the six-armed creature, which he stubbornly drove away from himself, still kept surfacing in his inflamed consciousness, causing an unpleasant chill somewhere in the solar plexus area and slight nausea. He took several deep breaths, trying to calm down. Just nervous a little. It's a responsible job, after all. "That's right to be nervous," Tommy unexpectedly softened. "That means your survival instinct is still working. It's worse when it's not there. All right, let's go. Time doesn't wait. The sooner we start, the sooner we finish. Closer to midnight, when the town finally plunged into heavy, restless sleep, and the streets emptied, lit only by rare flickering streetlights, they set off for the cemetery again. This time their path lay deep inside, to the old and long-abandoned part, where no one had been buried for many decades, and where even during the day random visitors rarely wandered. The central asphalt alley gave way to narrow, barely visible paths overgrown with grass, winding between tilted, sunken into the earth, moss-covered tombstones and rusty, creaking fences. The air here was even more stifling and heavy, smelling of dampness. The rot of century-old leaves, cemetery earth, and something else elusive, alarming, sickly sweet, from which the hair on the back of the neck involuntarily stirred, and a lump rose to the throat. It seemed the very silence here was different, viscous, oppressive, full of hidden sighs and unspoken curses. The moon, as if to spite them this night, almost didn't show itself, hiding behind a thick veil of low, heavy clouds, and they had to make their way almost by touch, lighting the way only with the uncertain, wavering beams of their flashlights. Darkness thickened around them, turning familiar outlines of trees and monuments into something alien and hostile. The branches of old, gnarled trees intertwined overhead, creating bizarre, frightening silhouettes resembling skeletal hands, or the legs of giant spiders reaching toward them from the darkness. Under their feet, dry branches constantly crunched, and each such sound echoed in the tense silence like deafening crackling, making them shudder and look around. Somewhere very close, they heard rustling, as if someone large and heavy was making their way through the bushes. Tommy sharply directed the flashlight beam in that direction, but saw only a swaying branch of an old hawthorn. Probably a cat or a hedgehog, he muttered, but his voice sounded uncertain. What a hellhole, Jake whispered in a trembling voice, trying to stay as close to Tommy as possible, almost stepping on his heels. It's probably creepy here even during the day, and at night it's just plain hell. Are you sure, Tommy, that we're going the right way? Maybe old Bill got something mixed up. Quiet, Tommy hissed at him, though he himself felt an unpleasant chill running down his spine. This place really pressed on the psyche. Don't jinx it. According to old Bill's descriptions, it should be somewhere around here. He said the landmark was an old oak split by lightning, huge. You can't mistake it for anything. From it, 20 steps north, there'll be a small clearing almost hidden by bushes. They wandered among the graves for a long time, stumbling over roots and falling into various holes, until they finally found what they were looking for. A huge oak, blackened by time and weather, indeed split by lightning almost to the very base, with charred wood gaping like a terrible wound, really looked ominous and impressive even in the darkness. Its wide crown, even without leaves, almost completely hid the sky. It seemed it had been a witness to many secrets and tragedies played out in this burial ground. From it, as old Bill had said, they counted 20 steps in the indicated direction, orienting by the compass on Tommy's phone, and found themselves in a small clearing overgrown with tall weeds and nettles, surrounded by a thick ring of wild bushes. Here, among the tall grass and weeds, several half-destroyed, tilted tombstones of dark, weathered stone were barely visible. Most of them had almost completely grown into the ground, the inscriptions on the stones erased by time, rain, and frost, turning into unreadable hieroglyphs. Tommy shone his flashlight, searching for the right grave. The air in the clearing was especially heavy and cold. It seemed the temperature here was several degrees lower than in the rest of the cemetery. Jake noticed that there was no dew on the grass, though everything around was wet from fog. "Here it is, I think," Tommy finally said, his voice slightly hoarse. He pointed the flashlight beam at an almost invisible earthen mound over which a tilted, broken stone cross rose forlornly, without any identifying marks. Only some faded letters could dimly be made out. At the foot of the cross, someone had once left a small, cracked porcelain doll's head with one eye. This sight made Jake's spine crawl. "Looks like what the old man described. Well, shall we begin? Say a prayer or whatever you non-believers do." He tried to joke, but it didn't come out very well. He took the backpack with tools off his shoulder, got out a shovel. Jake, swallowing the lump that had risen to his throat and trying not to look at the doll's head, followed his example. Hard work lay ahead, and he tried to concentrate on it, driving away all anxious thoughts and bad premonitions, though frankly speaking, it wasn't working very well. Something about this place was fundamentally wrong, oppressive, hostile to everything living. It seemed the very earth here was saturated with melancholy, pain, and age-old concentrated horror. And this horror seemed to be watching them from the darkness with invisible eyes. The earth in the old burial ground, in this forgotten corner of the cemetery, turned out to be surprisingly stubborn, as if compressed by centuries to stone and saturated not only with moisture, but with some kind of anomalous chill. The shovels with difficulty, with a screech, bit into the dense, settled soil, constantly hitting hidden stones under a thin layer of soil, and thick roots of old trees intertwined like snakes, which seemed to have grabbed this cursed earth with a death grip, not wanting to give up their grim secrets. Tommy, working silently, gritting his teeth and concentratedly, methodically threw out lump after lump of heavy, sticky earth. His muscles bulged under his old, sweaty jacket, experience told. He moved economically, but with great force, trying not to waste energy unnecessarily, breathing evenly, almost without getting lost. Jake, on the contrary, quickly got exhausted. His hands, unused to such exhausting physical labor, ached from tension. His palms burned despite the gloves. His breathing became rapid and intermittent. His heart pounded in his chest like a trapped bird. He kept stopping to catch his breath, leaning on the shovel handle and secretly glancing at Tommy, who seemed to be made of iron and wasn't thinking of getting tired. The raw November night grew colder. The piercing wind got under their clothes, making them shiver and chatter their teeth. The fog thickened, turning the surrounding world into a blurred, translucent haze where every bush, every tilted cross or fragment of a monument in the uncertain light of the flashlights looked like some sinister monster lurking in the darkness. Sometimes Jake thought he heard quiet whispers coming from behind the graves, but he attributed this to his overactive imagination and fatigue. "What's wrong, Jake, giving up, champ?" Tommy grinned, noticing that his partner was standing idle again, breathing heavily. His voice in the oppressive silence of the abandoned cemetery sounded unnaturally loud, almost defiant. "No, Tommy, everything's fine," Jake muttered, trying to hide his weakness and rising panic, and with fury, more for show, drove his shovel into the earth. "Just this place is somehow heavy, like there's not enough air." "Did you think you came to a resort in the mountains?" Tommy chuckled, not stopping digging. A cemetery is a cemetery, especially such a neglected one, forgotten by God and people. The energy here, you understand, isn't the most positive. It's been accumulating for centuries. Come on, don't get distracted, or we'll be digging until morning. And then the guards might start making rounds, even though they rarely look here. They had been digging for over an hour, and the coffin still didn't appear. The pit was getting deeper. Its edges began to crumble, and they had to constantly scrape away earth, expanding the working space. At some point, when Jake once again drove his shovel in with force, he hit something soft and yielding. Curiously, he pulled it to the surface. It turned out to be a small, decayed rag doll sewn from coarse burlap with buttons sewn on instead of eyes, one black, the other mother of pearl. The doll was damp and smelled of mold. Jake threw it aside with disgust. "Ugh, what nastiness," he muttered. Tommy just chuckled. The collector apparently left his mark right here. About 20 minutes later, Tommy's shovel hit something hard with a dull, prolonged wooden thud that echoed in the night silence. "Got it," he exhaled with undisguised relief. "Looks like we've reached it, native." They began working more carefully, no longer with shovels, but with their hands and small trenching tools, clearing earth around the long-awaited find. Soon, from under a thick layer of clay mixed with small stones and rotted roots, appeared the blackened by time, cracked and covered with a layer of greenish mold coffin lid. It was made of thick, almost rot-resistant oak boards, held together by massive forged iron strips completely covered with a thick layer of rust. No decorations, no carvings, a simple, crude, almost primitive box seemingly designed to stand in the earth for all eternity. "Well, Jake, moment of truth," Tommy said, setting aside his shovel. He took a small but strong crowbar and a more powerful flashlight from his backpack. His heart, despite all his experience, was beating frantically in anticipation. "Help me here, looks like these are serious nails, old school ones." Together they leaned on the lid, trying to pry it with the crowbar. The old forged nails, deeply embedded in the wood, gave way extremely reluctantly with a disgusting ear-piercing screech. The wood cracked, groaned, and crumbled, as if unwilling to part with its terrible contents, or release what had been locked inside for so many decades. Finally, with a loud, deafening crack that made Jake's ears ring, the coffin lid partially broke away, and immediately an incredibly strong, heavy, stale smell hit their noses. A suffocating mixture of century-old dust, decay, formaldehyde, and something else elusively sweet, almost perfume-like. But from this even more disgusting, from which Jake's stomach unpleasantly clenched and nausea rose to his throat. He barely restrained a gag reflex. Tommy shone the powerful flashlight beam into the formed crack. Jake, overcoming squeamishness, fear, and rising nausea, also looked inside, impatiently pushing Tommy aside. Instead of expected treasures, handfuls of gold coins sparkling in the flashlight light, old jewelry with precious stones, or a massive inlaid box that old Bill had so colorfully described. They saw something completely unimaginable, defying any logical explanation, and thoroughly creepy. In the decayed, turned to dust, once apparently white satin, now gray, half-rotten, slimy rags, lay a figure remotely, very remotely resembling an old tailor's mannequin or a large life-size doll. But this wasn't just a product of wood and fabric that you might see in museums or antique shops. In the dim, trembling flashlight light, they saw with horror that some parts of this creature were covered with patches of wrinkled, dried parchment-like skin of yellowish-brown, waxy color, tightly covering some unnaturally protruding bones or roughly carved wooden framework. On the head, if this ugly, spherical something could be called a head, preserved, were rare, tangled spider-web-like tufts of dark, coarse hair stuck to something resembling a bare skull or wooden dummy. But the most monstrous, most unnatural and frightening thing wasn't this. This creature lying in the coffin had 6 arms. Yes, exactly 6. Jake rubbed his eyes in disbelief, but the vision didn't disappear. 6 arms extending from the long, disproportionate torso at different unnatural angles. They were of different lengths, different thicknesses, and seemed made from different materials. 2 of them, the uppermost ones, growing almost from the neck, were thin, almost skeletal, with long, crooked witch-like fingers covered with that same dried parchment skin. These arms were unnaturally folded on the creature's chest, as if in some terrible parody of a prayer pose. 2 other arms, located slightly below in place of normal human ones, were noticeably thicker, more massive, and seemed entirely made of dark, polished to a shine, almost black wood. On them, crude, primitive but functional hinges were clearly visible, resembling the joints of an old marionette or knight's armor. And finally, the 2 lower arms, the shortest and thickest, extending from the sides of the torso almost at the very legs, were completely artificial, roughly assembled from some metallic shining plates, tubes, and gears, connected by rivets and bolts. These metal arms, with claw-like grippers at the ends, hung limply at the sides of the torso, touching the decayed coffin lining. The creature had no face, only a smooth, oval, slightly convex surface on which someone had once apparently tried to clumsily draw human features. But the paint had long since peeled, cracked, and worn away, leaving only unclear, blurred spots frightening in their indefiniteness, resembling blind eye sockets and a soundlessly screaming mouth. A dead, ringing silence fell, broken only by the intermittent asthmatic breathing of 2 stunned, horror-paralyzed grave robbers. Jake felt an icy wave of nausea rising to his throat, and his legs becoming cotton, refusing to hold him. This wasn't what he expected to see. This was worse than any most sophisticated nightmare born of a sick imagination. This was the embodiment of madness. "What is this, Tommy?" he whispered with his lips alone, unable to tear his mesmerized, horror-filled gaze from the terrible find. His voice trembled like his hands, which gripped the shovel handle in a death grip, which had suddenly become the only support in this world turned upside down. Tommy was silent. His usually swarthy, weathered face had become pale as a sheet, and in his always cynical and mocking eyes now reflected genuine primordial shock and some kind of bad, heavy thoughtfulness. He slowly, as if afraid to frighten the vision, swept the flashlight beam over the figure in the coffin, over every detail of it, as if trying to understand what this was, how it got here, and most importantly, what to do with it now. In his head echoed old Bill's words about black magic and attempts to animate. "I don't know, Jake," he finally squeezed out in a strangled, alien voice. "Looks like old Bill didn't lie about the eccentric collector and his specific hobbies. Only this isn't a doll or a mannequin. This is something else, some kind of devilish assembly." He reached out and carefully, with the tip of the crowbar, as if afraid of getting burned, touched one of the creature's wooden arms, the one with hinges. There was a quiet, dry, barely audible creak, like from a disturbed old, unlubricated mechanism, and Tommy thought. Or did the wooden fingers barely noticeably twitch? Jake recoiled so sharply he almost fell into the pit. "Tommy, don't touch it. Put the crowbar away. What if it's contagious or alive?" The last word he pronounced almost in a whisper, and it hung in the air like a sentence. "Come on, stop panicking," Tommy tried to encourage him and himself, though his voice no longer held a shadow of former confidence. His heart was pounding somewhere in his throat. It's been dead for 150 years, just very well preserved. Probably embalmed by some special recipe, these black magicians. He shone into the coffin again, feverishly searching with the beam along the bottom, trying to see if there was anything else besides this terrible, six-armed creation. Maybe a box or jewels hidden under it, under the decayed bedding. But there was nothing except small debris, decayed fabric, and some incomprehensible rust-like stains on the coffin bottom. No boxes, no bags of gold, no jewels. Only this silent, motionless, six-armed monster lying in what they thought was its final resting place. Jake's disappointment was immeasurable, almost physically tangible. Dig all night like convicts, risk freedom and health, freeze, shake with fear, only to find this abomination, this mockery of all his hopes. Anger and burning frustration overwhelmed him with new force, temporarily displacing even primitive fear. "That's it," he cried out, his voice breaking into a high, almost hysterical falsetto. "We worked so hard, spent so much effort for this scarecrow, this unfinished Frankenstein. Where's the gold, Tommy? Where's the treasure that old Bill promised? He screwed us, that old drunk." "Quiet, you idiot," Tommy angrily hissed at him, looking around. "Want to wake up the whole cemetery, wake the guards maybe. Maybe there are no treasures, maybe Bill just drank himself stupid with age and cheap vodka, got confused. Or maybe this is that valuable thing they buried with him, some crap for his black magic rituals, some satanic artifact. How should I know?" He looked at the six-armed figure with undisguised disgust and some hidden fear. "All right, Jake, screw the gold. There's nothing more to do here. Let's bury this abomination back and get out of here while we still can. I have a very bad feeling about this." But Jake, blinded by anger, disappointment, and greed that still wouldn't let go of him, didn't want to give up so easily. He had placed so many hopes on this fat tip, had already mentally spent non-existent money, imagined how he and Tommy would divide unimaginable riches, and here was this. Screw it all to hell. He swore furiously, and swinging with all his might, kicked with his foot, shod in a heavy army boot at the edge of the coffin, aiming right at the disgusting, faceless head of the figure. His boot hit something unexpectedly hard, almost stone-like, with a dull, heavy thud, and at that very moment, at this very cursed instant, what they both feared in the most secret depths of their souls happened, but what they refused to believe until the last moment, waving away bad premonitions. One of the thin, bony, withered arms of the creature, the one that until then had lain lifelessly and motionlessly on its chest, with unnatural lightning speed, contradicting all laws of physics and common sense, shot forward like a released spring and grabbed Jake's leg just above the ankle with a dead, icy grip. The fingers long, crooked, resembling gnarled bird claws covered with parchment skin, closed on his pants, and muscles with such inhuman, crushing force that Jake screamed, not from pain, which came a moment later, but from the freezing, paralyzing, all-consuming horror that pierced his mind and body. The world around him froze for a moment, turned into a still frame from a horror movie, and then exploded into a cacophony of nightmarish sounds. His own piercing, wild, almost animal howl full of pain and despair. The dry, creaking crack coming from the depths of the coffin, as if old bones were breaking or rusty mechanisms turning. And Tommy's short, frightened, incredulous exclamation. Jake felt the creature in the coffin stir, but not just stir, it began to come alive. The icy grip on his legs squeezed tighter and tighter, penetrating through the thick fabric of his jeans and boot lining, digging into his flesh with relentless rigidity. He felt the thin, but incredibly hard, steel-like bony fingers digging into his calf, crushing muscles and bones like a vice. Paralyzing animal terror chained his body. He couldn't move or scream, only a hoarse, strangled moan, resembling a death rattle, escaped from his parched throat. His eyes, dilated to the limit from inhuman fear and pain, were madly fixed on the coffin, from which came a quiet but distinct, continuous creaking, as if someone very old, inflexible, and incredibly strong was trying to straighten their joints that had been stiff for a century and a half. And this creaking was accompanied by quiet, barely audible clicking, as if some gears were turning inside the monster. Tommy, for some infinitely long moment, was stunned by the unreality of what was happening, by this nightmare come to life, but almost instinctively came to his senses. His many years of experience surviving in extreme situations, his cynicism and assumed composure flew off him in an instant like unnecessary husk, giving way to primitive, all-consuming fear and desperate, almost insane determination to save his partner, and most importantly, himself. "Hold on, Jake, don't pass out," he shouted, his voice breaking from tension. He grabbed his heavy spade shovel, which suddenly seemed light as a feather to him. He swung, and with all his strength, putting all his fear and fury into the blow, brought the steel, sharpened blade down on the arm holding Jake. There was a dull, nauseating squelching sound, as if the shovel had hit dry, but viscous wood covered with wet skin. But the grip didn't weaken by an iota. On the contrary, the fingers of the demonic creature squeezed even tighter, and Jake howled from piercing, unbearable pain that now shot through his leg like fire from ankle to thigh. He felt something crunch in his shin, and then the other 5 arms of the creature came to life, as if by some invisible command. The wooden limbs, with terrible, prolonged creaking of ancient hinges, reached out of the coffin, feeling for support on the edge of the pit. The metal arms, with disgusting clanging and grinding, opened their crude, crab-claw-like finger grippers, ready to tear and crush. The 2 upper bony arms, until that moment folded on the creature's chest, slowly, as if reluctantly but with some terrible purposefulness, reached toward the edge of the coffin, grasping the earth with their long, root-like fingers. "Tommy, help me, it's dragging me in." Jake's voice was full of horror and a death plea. He tried to crawl away, to tear his crushed leg from this dead grip, but the creature held him firmly, relentlessly, like a trap. Tommy struck with the shovel at the arm again, then again and again. He beat with the fury and desperation of a cornered animal, but it was like trying to chop down a century-old oak with a dull axe or cut a steel cable. The arm didn't yield. Only the dry parchment skin crumbled a little from the impact, revealing something dark, hard, and shining underneath, resembling tarred, petrified wood or polished bone. One of the massive wooden arms, the right one, with amazing speed and precision for its apparent clumsiness and bulkiness. Like a living snake, shot toward him, and with an iron grip grabbed him by the throat. The fingers, hard and cold as stone, absolutely lifeless, but possessing monstrous strength, closed on his neck, instantly cutting off access to oxygen. Tommy wheezed, instinctively trying to tear this terrible, strangling grip from himself, but the forces were clearly unequal. The shovel fell from his weakened hands and hit the damp earth with a thud. His vision darkened, red, orange, and black circles danced before his face. His lungs burned with fire. With a terrible, continuous creaking of its numerous joints, the six-armed collector, this living spawn of a sick mind and black magic, leaned over the grave, dragging behind it the crazed with horror and pain Jake. The last thing Tommy saw before consciousness finally left him, and the world plunged into saving darkness, was Jake's face, distorted by inhuman fear and death agony. His wide-open, horror-filled eyes disappearing into the black, fetid abyss of the freshly dug grave. And then he saw 6 arms, bony, wooden, and metal, methodically, mercilessly, and with some terrible efficiency, dragging his writhing body into the damp, cold earth, to the bones of long-dead people who were already waiting for a new neighbor. And then darkness and silence swallowed him. The collector had acquired a new exhibit, or maybe 2. The next morning, when the first timid rays of autumn sun barely penetrated through the ragged clouds and remnants of night fog, Old Bill, tormented by a heavy hangover, headache, and vague, inexplicable anxiety, still decided to visit the old cemetery. Curiosity, fueled by yesterday's vodka and remnants of greed, overcame both fear and bad premonitions that had kept him awake all night. He couldn't get rid of the thought about what valuable thing those 2 city hustlers, Tommy and Jake, might have found in the grave of the old, forgotten-by-all collector. Maybe he'd get something if he was lucky, and they turned out to be generous. And if not lucky, then at least he'd see what kind of artifact it was. The closer he got to the abandoned, oldest part of the cemetery, the stronger this unpleasant, gnawing feeling of anxiety became. A premonition of something irreparable and terrible. Stumbling among graves, tripping over roots, he found the place he had so colorfully described to Tommy yesterday. The clearing with tilted, moss-covered crosses, the old oak split by lightning, ominously blackening against the morning sky. Everything was in place. Even the doll's head with one eye lay forlornly at the foot of the nameless cross, and the collector's grave was also in place. Only it looked somehow very strange, not at all like a dug-up and hastily buried grave should look. The earth on it was freshly disturbed. That was visible, but at the same time neat, even too neat, as if someone had worked here very carefully, and for a long time with a shovel, and then also tramped down the earth. No traces of Tommy and Jake's recent work. No earth scattered around, no broken branches, no coffin lid thrown aside. Just a neat, slightly raised earthen mound like those on fresh, newly made burials. And next to it, next to the collector's grave, Old Bill saw what made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end, and an icy, paralyzing horror run down his spine. Blood froze in his veins. 2 small, fresh earthen mounds, also neatly covered with earth and even slightly tramped down. They were shallow, elongated, and by their shape too sickeningly reminded him of graves. 2 fresh, nameless, unmarked graves that yesterday He was absolutely sure of this, definitely weren't here. Next to one of these mounds, a gold chain gleamed dully in the grass, the very one Tommy had taken from the authority figure. And on the other mound lay a lonely army boot. Old Bill crossed himself with a shaking hand and quickly, almost running, left this cursed place. Some secrets are better left untouched, and some stories are better left untold. The collector had completed his collection, and now in the old, forgotten part of Greenwood Cemetery, under the shadow of the lightning-split oak, 3 graves lay side by side, one old and 2 fresh. And sometimes, on particularly dark and foggy nights, cemetery guards claimed they could hear quiet, rhythmic sounds coming from that abandoned corner, as if someone was digging. But no one dared to go check. After all, who in their right mind would wander around an old cemetery at night, especially in a place with such a dark reputation? The collector's work continued, and his collection grew. And somewhere in the darkness between the graves, 6 arms patiently waited for new visitors, new exhibits for the eternal museum of horrors, hidden beneath the cold earth of the old burial ground. The streetlights cast long shadows across the empty campus walkways, their amber glow fighting a losing battle against the November darkness. Most students had already retreated to their dorm rooms or apartments, but for Mia and Jessica, the night was just beginning. Their cramped studio apartment buzzed with the nervous energy of all-nighters. Textbooks sprawled across every surface like fallen soldiers in their academic war. "I can't do this anymore," Jessica groaned, pushing back from the rickety desk they shared. Her economics textbook seemed to mock her with its endless charts and graphs. "My brain feels like mush, and I swear these numbers are doing the cha-cha in front of my eyes." The refrigerator hummed mockingly in the corner, as empty as their wallets after textbook purchases. Mia looked up from her accounting notes, rubbing her stiff neck. Familiar ache of stress and poor posture settled between her shoulder blades like an old friend. "Same here. My stomach's been growling for the past hour," Mia admitted, though something about the idea of venturing out this late made her uncomfortable. She'd always been the cautious one, the friend who checked locks twice and avoided shortcuts through dark alleys. "Remember that food truck we passed last week, the one behind the old textile factory?" Jessica's eyes lit up with sudden inspiration. Victor's Midnight Kitchen or something like that. The guy said they're open 24/7, and those construction workers were raving about their burgers. Mia frowned. The industrial district wasn't exactly the safest part of town, especially after dark. Abandoned warehouses and empty lots stretched for blocks, punctuated only by the occasional working factory or truck stop. "I don't know, Jess. That area gives me the creeps. Can't we just order pizza?" "Come on, Mia." Jessica was already reaching for her jacket. "We're broke, remember. That food truck was way cheaper than anything that delivers here. Plus, we need the fresh air. This place is starting to feel like a tomb." The November wind bit through their jackets as they walked down the deserted streets. Their footsteps echoed off the brick walls of shuttered businesses and empty storefronts. The transition from campus to industrial district was gradual but noticeable. Fewer streetlights, more broken windows, and that persistent smell of rust and old machinery that seemed to seep into everything. The food truck sat in what used to be a factory parking lot, its cheerful yellow paint job looking almost absurd against the backdrop of chain-link fences and corrugated metal buildings. Warm light spilled from its service window, and the smell of grilled meat and onions cut through the cold air. Hand-painted sign hung crooked above the window. "Victor's Midnight Kitchen, fresh food around the clock." "See, it's not so bad," Jessica said, Though her voice carried less conviction than her words as they approached, Mia noticed there were no other customers. No line of hungry workers, no late-night partiers grabbing a quick bite. Just them and the truck, isolated in this pocket of industrial nowhere. The generator hummed loudly, masking any other sounds that might have warned them. Victor emerged from the truck's interior like a bear from hibernation. He was a massive man, probably in his 50s, with graying hair slicked back and arms that suggested a lifetime of heavy labor. His apron was stained with what Mia hoped was just grease and sauce, and when he smiled, his teeth seemed too white, too perfect for someone working out of a food truck in the middle of nowhere. "Ladies, welcome to my little slice of heaven." His voice carried a slight accent, though Mia couldn't place it. "You're out late for such pretty girls. Lucky for you, I've got the best burgers this side of the Mississippi." Something about his smile made Mia's skin crawl. It was too wide, too eager, and it never reached his eyes. Those pale blue eyes seemed to take in every detail about them, their clothes, their jewelry, the way Jessica fidgeted when nervous. "2 cheeseburgers, please," Jessica said, pulling crumpled bills from her pocket. "With everything, everything." "I like that," Victor chuckled, a sound like gravel in a cement mixer. "You ladies are in for a treat. My meat is special, very fresh, very tender." He disappeared back into the truck, and they could hear him moving around inside. The sounds were wrong somehow, too precise, too methodical, like a surgeon preparing for an operation rather than a cook making burgers. The smell that drifted from the truck was heavy and cloying, mixing the expected sense of grilled meat with something else. Something chemical and unpleasant that made Mia think of hospitals and morgues. "This was a mistake," Mia whispered, tugging on Jessica's sleeve. "Something's off about this place." "You're being paranoid," Jessica replied, but her voice was quieter now, less certain. "Look, he's almost done. We'll grab the food and get out of here." Victor reappeared with 2 paper-wrapped bundles, his pale eyes glinting in the truck's harsh, fluorescent light. When he handed Jessica her change, his fingers lingered on her palm just a moment too long. They were cold and slightly damp, like meat that had been refrigerated too long. "Enjoy, ladies. And if you like what you taste, tell your friends. I'm always looking for new customers," he said, that unsettling smile never wavering. They walked quickly away from the truck, not speaking until they reached a bench under one of the few working streetlights in the area. The bench sat beside a small pocket park, really just a patch of grass and a few struggling trees that the city had planted years ago in a failed attempt to beautify the industrial district. "Finally," Jessica said, unwrapping her burger with enthusiasm. "I'm so hungry I could eat a horse." The burgers looked normal enough in the dim light. Standard buns, lettuce, tomato, cheese, and what appeared to be a thick beef patty. But as Jessica took her first bite, Mia noticed her expression change. The enthusiasm faded, replaced by confusion, then disgust. "Jess, what's wrong?" Jessica chewed slowly, her face contorting. "The meat, it tastes weird, not bad exactly, just different, and the texture is all wrong." She picked at the burger with her fingers, pulling apart the layers. "Look at this." In the weak streetlight, the meat looked pale and stringy, not like any beef Mia had ever seen. It had an almost gray tinge to it, and the fibers seemed too coarse, too irregular. Jessica held up a piece on her finger, and Mia could swear she saw it twitch slightly. "Did that just move?" Mia whispered. "Don't be ridiculous, it's just—" Jessica's words cut off in a sharp intake of breath. The piece of meat in her fingers was definitely moving now, contracting and expanding in a slow, rhythmic pulse like a tiny heart. Jessica screamed and flung the meat away from her, jumping up from the bench. The small piece hit the ground and continued its grotesque pulsing for several more seconds before finally going still. What the hell was that? Jessica's voice was shaking now, all her earlier bravado gone. Mia stared at her own untouched burger, her appetite completely vanished. With trembling hands, She unwrapped it completely and began to dissect it under the streetlight. What she found made her stomach lurch violently. The meat wasn't beef. It wasn't any kind of meat she recognized. The pale, fibrous substance was shot through with what looked like tiny veins, and scattered throughout were small, hard objects that definitely weren't supposed to be there. She used her finger to fish one out and held it up to the light. It was a tooth. Small and pointed, not human, but definitely a tooth. "Oh God," Mia gasped, dropping the burger like it was on fire. "Jessica, look at this." But Jessica was already backing away, her face pale with terror. "I ate that. I actually ate that. What was it?" "What did we just?" A low growl cut through the night air, coming from the darkness beyond the small park. It wasn't the sound of any dog or cat they'd ever heard. It was deeper, more primal, the sound of something wild and hungry. The growl came again, closer this time, and with it came the sound of something large moving through the underbrush. Branches snapped and leaves rustled as whatever was out there approached their little circle of light. "We need to go." "Now," Mia said, grabbing Jessica's arm. Before they could move, it emerged from the shadows. The creature was like nothing from any biology textbook. It stood about 4 feet tall at the shoulder, with a lean, muscular body covered in patchy, grayish fur. Its limbs were unnaturally long and jointed in ways that seemed wrong, giving it an insectoid quality despite its mammalian appearance. The head was the worst part, elongated and narrow, with rows of needle-sharp teeth visible even when its mouth was closed. But it was the eyes that truly terrified them. Large and intelligent, they glowed with a sickly yellow light in the darkness. These weren't the eyes of a mindless beast. There was calculation there, hunger, and something that might have been recognition. The creature stared at them for a long moment, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Then it opened its mouth wider than should have been possible, revealing multiple rows of those needle teeth, and let out a sound that was part roar, part shriek. "Run," Mia screamed. They bolted from the bench, leaving their bags and the horrible burgers behind. Jessica, despite having longer legs, stumbled almost immediately, the shock and fear making her clumsy. Mia grabbed her friend's hand and pulled her along as the creature bounded after them with fluid, predatory grace. Industrial district that had seemed merely unpleasant before now became a maze of terror. They ran between empty buildings and around shipping containers, their footsteps echoing off metal walls. Behind them, they could hear the creature's claws scraping against concrete and metal as it pursued them. Jessica tripped over a piece of rebar and went down hard, skinning her knees on the rough pavement. As Mia turned to help her up, she saw the creature leap onto the roof of a nearby building, silhouetted against the night sky like a gargoyle come to life. "Get up. It's right behind us." It ran deeper into the industrial maze, turning corners at random, no longer caring about direction, only distance. The creature seemed to be hurting them, cutting off escape routes and forcing them deeper into the abandoned section of the district. Finally, gasping and exhausted, they found themselves in a dead-end alley between 2 massive warehouse buildings. At the far end stood a loading dock with its metal door rolled up, revealing only darkness beyond. "In there," Jessica panted. "We can hide." "That's exactly what it wants us to do," Mia replied. But she could hear the creature getting closer, its claws clicking on pavement. They had no choice. They ran into the warehouse, immediately swallowed by absolute darkness. The smell hit them instantly, the same chemical stench they'd noticed at the food truck, but 100 times stronger. It was the smell of death and preservation, of things that should have been buried long ago. Jessica pulled out her phone, using its flashlight to illuminate their surroundings. They were in some kind of processing facility. Stainless steel tables lined the room, and hanging from the ceiling were dozens of metal hooks on chains. The floor was stained with dark patches that reflected their phone's light wetly. "This is where he prepares the meat," Mia whispered, the full horror of the situation finally sinking in. Along one wall, they could see cages. Most were empty, but a few contained shapes that moved restlessly in the darkness. Jessica's light swept across them. They caught glimpses of creatures similar to the one that had chased them, but smaller, sicklier looking. Some had patches of fur missing, revealing sickly gray skin underneath. "He's breeding them," Jessica said, her voice barely audible. A slow clap echoed through the warehouse, and they spun around to see Victor emerging from the shadows near the entrance. In his hand was a cattle prod, its tip crackling with electricity. "Very good, ladies. Most people never figure it out. Just eat and leave, none the wiser." His voice was different now, colder, more confident. The folksy charm was completely gone. "But you too, you had to go poking around, didn't you? You're sick," Mia said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Those things, what are they?" Victor smiled, and in the harsh light of Jessica's phone, his teeth looked different, sharper. "My little livestock. Took me years to breed them properly. The meat has such a unique flavor, and the profit margins are incredible. You have any idea how much a single burger costs me to produce? About 12 cents. People are eating those things." Jessica's voice was rising toward hysteria. "Oh, not just eating them, my dear. Sometimes they become them." Victor's smile widened. "You see, the creatures have a rather interesting reproductive cycle. Their saliva contains certain enzymes that can alter human DNA under the right conditions. Not immediately, of course. It takes time. Days, sometimes weeks." Felt ice forming in her veins. "Jessica didn't eat enough didn't she?" Victor interrupted. "How much is enough, do you think? A bite? A single drop of saliva mixed with the meat? I'm afraid the science is still developing." Jessica looked down at her hands in horror, as if expecting to see claws growing from her fingertips. "You're lying. You're just trying to scare us." "Am I?" Victor pulled out a small remote and pressed a button. Several of the cages along the wall opened with metallic clangs. "Why don't you ask them?" The creatures that emerged weren't the same as the one that had chased them. These were smaller, more human-like in some ways, but wrong in others. They moved on two legs but hunched over, their arms too long for their bodies. Their faces still held traces of human features, but distorted, as if someone had tried to sculpt a person from memory and gotten the proportions all wrong. "The transformation isn't always complete," Victor explained conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "Some subjects retain more of their human characteristics than others. These particular specimens were college students, just like yourselves. They came to my truck about 6 months ago." One of the transformed creatures raised its head, and Mia saw with horror that its eyes still held a spark of human intelligence. It tried to speak, but all that came out was a wet, clicking sound. "The good news," Victor continued, "is that the process is usually painless. The subjects report feeling drowsy, then confused, then they stop reporting anything at all." Mia grabbed Jessica's hand. They had to get out of here. Behind Victor, the entrance to the warehouse was still open, but he stood directly in their path. The cattle prod in his hand sparked ominously. "Now, I'm going to need you ladies to come with me. I have a special holding area where you can wait out the transformation process in comfort. Well, relative comfort." "No," Mia said firmly. "We're leaving," Victor laughed. "I don't think you understand the situation. You've seen too much, you know too much. And more importantly, one of you is already infected. I can't let you leave and contaminate others." "You don't know that Jessica is infected," Mia said, trying to keep him talking while she looked for another way out. "True. But why take chances? I've been in this business long enough to know that witnesses are bad for business. Very bad indeed." He raised the cattle prod and stepped toward them. That's when Mia noticed something. One of the transformed creatures behind Victor was moving differently from the others. Where they seemed confused and docile, this one was focused, alert. It was watching Victor with what looked like hatred. "Jessica," Mia whispered, When I say run, head for that door on the far side of the room. But just trust me." Mia picked up a piece of metal pipe from the floor and threw it as hard as she could at the nearest cage. It hit with a loud clang, and all the creatures in the warehouse turned toward the sound. In that moment of distraction, the alert creature behind Victor pounced. It wasn't much of a fight. Victor was a big man, but the creature was faster and driven by what could only be described as revenge. They went down in a tangle of limbs, Victor's screams echoing off the metal walls. "Run," Mia shouted. They raced toward the door Mia had spotted, Jessica's phone light bouncing wildly as they ran. Behind them, they could hear Victor's screams getting weaker, punctuated by wet, tearing sounds that Mia tried not to think about. The door led to another alley, and this one had an exit to the street. They ran until their lungs burned, not stopping until they reached the main road where traffic still moved and streetlights provided blessed illumination. Jessica was the first to call 911, her voice shaking as she tried to explain to the dispatcher what they'd seen. Mia sat on the curb beside her, watching her friend's hands for any signs of change, any indication that Victor hadn't been lying about the transformation. The police found the warehouse exactly as they'd described it. Victor's body was discovered torn apart, apparently killed by one of his own creatures. The surviving transformed beings were taken to a secure medical facility where doctors tried to understand what had been done to them. The story made national news for about a week. "Cannibal food truck owner fed human-animal hybrids to customers," the headlines screamed. Then, as these things do, it faded from public attention, replaced by newer tragedies and scandals. Jessica never showed signs of transformation. Whatever Victor's creatures were, apparently a single bite wasn't enough to trigger the change. But she was never quite the same afterward. She became vegetarian, for one thing, and couldn't tolerate the smell of cooking meat without becoming nauseous. Mia changed too. She found herself checking and double-checking everything she ate, researching restaurants obsessively, avoiding any establishment that couldn't provide detailed information about their meat sources. She saw Victor's face in every food service worker, heard that wet clicking sound in every unexplained noise. The worst part was the dreams. Night after night, she would find herself back in that warehouse, watching those poor transformed creatures trying to speak, trying to remember what they used to be. She would wake up screaming, convinced she could smell that chemical stench of death and preservation. 6 months later, she transferred to a different college in another state, leaving behind everything that reminded her of that night. Jessica stayed, but they gradually lost touch. Some experiences create bonds between people, others drive them apart. Their shared trauma fell into the latter category. Mia tried to rebuild her life, to find some sense of normalcy. She was mostly successful. She finished her degree, got a job, even started dating again. But she never ate from food trucks. She never walked alone at night. And she never stopped checking the news for stories about missing people and mysterious illnesses, because deep down, she knew that Victor hadn't been working alone. Operations like his don't exist in isolation. They're part of something larger, something more organized. Someone had taught him how to breed those creatures, how to process the meat, how to distribute it without getting caught. A year later, she was scrolling through social media when she saw a post from a friend back at her old college. It was a picture of a new food truck that had opened near campus. Antonio's Authentic Tacos, the sign read. Fresh meat daily. The truck was painted bright red instead of yellow, and the man in the photo was Hispanic instead of pale and heavyset. But something about his smile made Mia's blood run cold. It was too wide, too eager, and it didn't reach his eyes. She tried to tell herself it was just paranoia, just her mind playing tricks on her. but she couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in another industrial district, in another abandoned warehouse, the cages were being filled again. The cycle was starting over, and this time she wasn't there to warn anyone. Thank you for spending this time with Brad Arrows. We hope the stories whispered through the rain carried you far into your imagination or your dreams. If you're still awake, let us know how you liked the journey. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and let the darkness comfort you.